I never imagined my world could shatter so suddenly. Jill was my love, my life, my everything. But one text message changed it all. She betrayed me, and it tore my soul apart. My grief, my anger, my need for revenge spiraled out of control. How could she love him? How could she leave me with this torment? I had to face the truth, uncover the lies, and seek my own redemption. This is my story. Enjoy watching it. I didn't feel like talking, so I blocked all numbers except family and work. Family mostly meant Isla. For 3 months, I only dealt with Ayla and work. My phone rang. It woke me up. My thoughts were slow, and the ringing felt like it cut through my headache. With a groan, I pushed the phone off the bed and covered my ears with a pillow. It kept ringing on the floor. What time was it? I looked at the digital clock. 3:13 a.m. Jill would call it 0313 hours. I smirked. Jill was my childhood friend and my lovely wife who had promised to love me forever. The ringing stopped. I relaxed. Then it started ringing again. Ugh! I put the pillow on top of it, but it kept ringing. I rolled to the edge of the bed and looked over. The screen was lit up. It was Isla. I rolled onto my back. Great. Her sister Isla pronounced I-Lu. I imagined this late-night call. Kyle, why didn't you answer? Because I drink too much now. It's what I do. I don't have a life anymore. Haven't been to work much. Haven't read a book. Haven't done anything. I wanted to feel the sadness in those words, but they weren't all true. I'd done some work, looking over edits from my team. I'd talked to my boss, Sharon. I'd texted a lot with Murray, who took on a lot of my work. I just said I had a personal problem, and they didn't ask questions. I let Murray know a bit more over time, so I'm sure they both knew what was up, both workmates and friends. I was still drinking, but only in the evenings to stop the dreams. It didn't work. Ayla would sigh, but probably not criticize me. She might think, but not say, "Get up, Kyle, it's been 3 months." Ayla always seemed a bit better than others, in all the ways that mattered. Ayla was amazing in every way. She'd be full of understanding. I should hang up or just let it be. Something. I didn't know what to do. The ringing stopped, so I didn't have to decide. Ayla rarely called before the trouble started. Since then, she called every few days. Once, she called to say her parents offered their home to me until things got better. Other times, she called to tell me that Jill and I could fix things and love could win. At that, I hung up. They always assumed we'd get back together eventually. I didn't mind getting back together, but I had to think about divorce, too. Life without Jill was something I'd never thought about before. Not ever. But I thought about it for 3 months. I had time, I figured. She wouldn't be home for months. Afghanistan was far away. The phone rang again, and I ignored it until it stopped. Maybe there was a big family meeting, or Jill wanted a divorce decision, or Isla was drunk. Imagine Isla drunk. Maybe Gil was getting another degree and felt the need to tell everyone right now, middle of the night, emergency family news. Aren't you happy for him? When you're down, you want company. Gil was my friend. He should join my misery. It rang again a few minutes later. I rolled over and saw its light on the floor under the pillow. So much, so often, so late, she wouldn't give up. I reached for it, pushed the pillow aside, saw it. Isla again, of course. I answered to make it stop. "Yeah, hello?" I said. "Don't mess with me, please." Ayla was silent, unusually quiet. I waited for her anger. I had ignored her, her mom, her dad, and her husband since finding out the truth about my marriage. Finally, Ayla spoke calmly. Kyle, listen. Listen carefully. She was killed, Kyle. Jill. In Afghanistan." I felt a blow inside me, a sudden emptiness like I was looking down a tunnel. I said nothing because so many feelings hit me one after another. Anger, sadness, loss, and something like relief. They piled on top of me. I felt heavy inside. Jill was dead. I cried out, frustrated and angry and empty. "No!" I felt less than I had been, and I'd never be more again, I was sure. Life could always get worse, worse than the worst I'd felt. Dunn was right. Death makes us all a little smaller, no matter how small we already are. Isla waited, patient. I breathed into the phone. I wished she were here, someone to hug. No, not just anyone. Isla to hug. No, just no. Why'd they come so late? At night? I asked. Jill had said they didn't come in the middle of the night. They've been looking for you for 2 days. They couldn't reach you with your blocked number. They were worried it would get out. No one in the Marines could call home until her family was told. They broke a rule coming so late. I see, I said. I blocked everyone but work and family. I need some time, please. She said, call me when you want to talk, Kyle. Or when you're sober. I know how you must feel. I understand your situation. We're all awake and will be. Call whenever. Or just come over when you're ready. I heard crying in the background, and then Ayla crying as she hung up, like she'd held it in and now could let go. I'd heard her cry before, but not like this. I'd never heard her wail. The line went dead. I put my cell phone down on the table and stared at nothing in particular. The news had hit me hard, but the lingering heaviness in my head from too much drinking wouldn't go away. It felt like all our lives were weighing on me. Memories came rushing in. As kids, we climbed trees, hit baseballs, and scraped our knees. We played together, laughed, cried, and shared everything. During summer and on Saturdays, I'd be at Jill and Ayla's house by 9 in the morning. Sometimes Jill would be at my door even earlier, calling my name, Kyle, Kyle! My dad liked Jill and never scolded her, even though he wished to sleep in. Until she joined the Marines through Naval ROTC, we were inseparable. Now, Jill was dead. A woman I loved was dead. I went to the kitchen and made some coffee. I sat at the small table in the motel, watching the steam rise from my cup, and drank it black even though I hated it that way. My grandmother used to stare off into space like this in the early mornings when I was a kid. Maybe she was thinking of Grandpa. Mornings are good for staring and not thinking. With my eyes closed, I saw Jill running bases, typing on a keyboard, reading at church. I saw her studying in the library, hiking and laughing in restaurants, kissing me softly. I pictured her in a bikini the day we first got close. I remembered our times together, filled with love and energy. Even though she had an affair, I cherished our past. We mattered. We were real for a long time. I felt the loss deeply. No woman I loved had ever died before. Now they all had. Did she die in his arms? Was his name on her lips? Did she beg him to say he loved her? Is it okay to cry for a wife who didn't love you in the end?
Hi, I'm Ayla, Dad, and I talked about that night many times. It was the worst night of our lives. 2 Marine officers showed up around 2:30 in the morning. Mom and Dad went to the door together, worried about such a late visit. Dad said, "Let me open it." So Mom stepped back. He opened the door a little, then all the way. When Mom saw who it was, she fainted, but Dad caught her. It was only a moment before she came to, and one Marine helped Dad get her to the couch. "I'm Captain Thomas Sheehan, the casualty assistance officer here," he started. "This is Lieutenant Mark Smith. I need to confirm your identity." "Are you the parents of Major Jill Kinnison?" the captain asked. "Yes, Captain," Dad said, holding Mom as she cried. "We couldn't find her listed next of kin," the captain continued. He took a deep breath and looked at them directly. "I regret to inform you that Major Jill Kinnison, USMC, was killed in action," he said, finishing his prepared statement. Dad and Mom clung to each other. The silence was heavy. "Sir," the Marine continued after a pause, "we've been unable to contact the Major's husband, Kyle Franklin. His phone is out of service, and he hasn't been at his residence at Camp Lejeune." "No, Kyle's somewhere around here. Our other daughter can call him. I need to tell her," Dad said, starting to function again. "The call is a memory I wish I could forget, so I won't recount it here. I was awake, having just had a nice evening with my husband Gil. He was asleep beside me. I liked hearing him breathe. The phone rang once, and I answered it, scared of a late call. Dad spoke. I cried and called out Jill's name to Gil, and he knew. He held me as I listened to Dad. "I'll come over," I said, and clung to Gil. I calmed down in his arms, kissed him, and got dressed quickly. My mind was racing. "I need to call Kyle. I have to go to my parents' house. I'll call him from there. Marines are there," Dad said. Gil nodded. "I'll keep the girls home and wait until you're back to tell them," he said. "Drive safely." I married a good man. He kissed my forehead, and I left. A few minutes later, I rushed into my parents' house and hugged them. I noticed one Marine giving the other a look. It was not a smile, more like a widening of the eyes, just a reaction. There was nothing inappropriate. "Kyle, have you reached Kyle?" Mom asked. She always worried about him, even in these last hard months. They couldn't find him. The captain nodded. We usually don't come this late, but there was a communication blackout in Afghanistan. We didn't want you to find out online, he said, looking worried about breaking the late-night rule. Seeing that Mom and Dad couldn't speak yet, I took charge. We understand. I'll reach Kyle if he answers. I think I know where he is, I said, holding it together for now, for Kyle. Ma'am, the Marine said, we're supposed to notify him in person. I shook my head. No, he'd rather hear it from me. He won't want to be seen like this, I said. Kyle was probably drunk. He had been drunk several times when I called in the evenings. I looked at the captain, right in his eyes, and I believed he saw honesty. Kyle's my best friend, I added. I'll make sure he understands. He nodded. He was breaking rules, but at least the mission was moving forward. I finally reached Kyle after trying many times. The Marine sat in the living room talking quietly with Mom and Dad. They probably heard me tell Kyle to sober up and might have thought something else was happening. When I hung up, I couldn't hold it together anymore, and I started to cry. Mom and Dad joined me. The captain and the lieutenant just waited. Finally, we were quiet. They talked about the details. The body was not in the U.S. yet. She died in an explosion during a grenade attack on her vehicle. They would need to talk to Kyle in a day or so about the funeral, insurance, housing, and other things that have to be handled when a Marine dies. I gave them my number and told them I could usually get hold of Kyle if no one else could. The captain wrote some things in a small notebook. I made coffee. Mom and Dad stayed on the couch. I brought each of them a cup, and I also brought one to the Marine after asking him. I sat in the big chair. We sipped the coffee, all of us drinking it black. No one wanted to get up to find cream or sugar. We told stories. Dad remembered Jill avoiding a tag to score a run when she played hardball with Kyle. Mom remembered her crying after 6 bees stung her when she was a kid, and Kyle waiting patiently to comfort her. I told them about how we'd play capture the flag with the Marines against the Army, and the 2 Marines smiled. Gentle stories brought little smiles to our faces. The Marines eventually stood up. Ladies, sir, we will be leaving now. We will be in touch soon. You can call me any time, the captain said, handing a card to Dad and giving 2 to me. Please have Mr. Franklin contact me soon. We'll show ourselves out. You have our sincere condolences. I stood and shook hands with each of them. The lieutenant, who seemed a bit out of place, nodded, and they left. We sat and cried for a bit, hardly believing she was gone. Another half-hour passed. The doorbell rang, perhaps not as a surprise. It was Kyle. I opened the door and he stepped in. I hugged him tightly. I felt his arms around me, one of the few times we had hugged tightly. Mom and Dad waited in the room while we whispered. I can't believe this, Kyle said. I know, I said. It will never be the same. The whole thing, he said, and I squeezed him harder. I felt him against me, and for once he didn't pull away. I didn't smell alcohol. I did smell mouthwash. Good. I wanted to stay in that warm hug, but the world around us was real. We walked into the room. Mom hugged Kyle for a long time, also whispering to him. Then Dad hugged him and shook his hand briefly. We should sit, Mom said. The Marines left a while ago. I'll get some coffee, Kyle said. We found our seats. Kyle came back with his coffee black and sat by Mom on the couch. Dad said, we were telling stories about Jill. It was quiet for a while. Mom was whimpering softly, and Dad was shaking at times. Dad, remember the day she said she wanted to join the Marines? I asked, and he smiled and nodded. I told the story with fondness. She was a senior in high school and asked me to sit at the table with Dad and her just to be there. Kyle was away at Miami, partway into his sophomore year. I was home from Dayton to observe some teachers. Jill was determined to make this argument to Dad now. Dad, I want you to listen, she said. She was nervous. I saw Dad glance at her left hand, thinking she might be engaged. I smiled. That wouldn't have surprised us either. Okay, go ahead, he said. I want to join the Marines, she said. She had never said it out loud to Mom or Dad. Every kid in the neighborhood knew it for years. You want what? Dad said. It wasn't really a question. It was a surprise that should not have been. Kyle and she never talked about their dreams or plans with adults. She was open with her own generation, though. She and I had talked about how dorky the women Marine dress skirts were. She kept bringing up the Marines in high school. "I want to join ROTC," she said. "I think I can get a scholarship. My scores were high, you know. You were in the Marines and so was Grandpa. Why can't a girl want to be in the Marines?" Girl was a strange word for a high school senior to use for herself. Dad exhaled. I realized he thought she meant to skip college and enlist. He was obviously relieved at the words scholarship and ROTC. He took his time answering. It was his usual way. "What about Kyle? You must be serious. What does he think?" "We are serious. We've talked about getting married, and we'll get engaged when I'm in college," she said. "No, I mean," he said, "how will your being in the service affect him?" Dad didn't know what Kyle's hopes were. Kyle was studying English composition and American history, but he never talked to anyone but Jill and sometimes me about a career. He wanted to work in publishing, maybe as a writer. Kyle was getting noticed by his teachers at Miami, winning and placing in 2 writing contests as a sophomore. He just never told our parents that he'd won something. He never bragged or showed off an award. He left that to Jill and me. "He's willing to go where I'm stationed," he says. "He thinks we may have to be apart sometimes, but that goes for any military family. He's a good guy," she said. "He expects to be able to work from home, in publishing. That's what he hopes anyway." I thought she sounded positive and ready, prepared. She told me she planned out the whole thing ahead of time. That was like Jill. Dad looked a little strange. "You love Kyle, don't you?" he asked. It was a funny question because everyone knew Jill and Kyle were perfect for each other. People thought they'd get married for sure. "You'll be around a lot of men in the Marines. Will Kyle be jealous?" "Yes, I love Kyle, but I want to do this too. No one can come between us. Kyle is like a part of me. You know us. If Kyle's unhappy, we'll figure it out together," she said. "Even if it means I leave the Marines. He thinks being a civilian will make things easier for us. He's understanding." 2 kids with little experience wanted to face the world. I almost laughed. Jill was so careful and dedicated. She would find a way to succeed. Kyle? He loved Jill. He'd make it work. He thought her dream of the Marines was funny and exciting. Dad looked at her. "He has to be first, though. You and he must work as a team, deciding what's best for your life together. Family comes first, and it will just be him for you at first." "A lone Marine husband?" Jill nodded. It was a long talk for Dad. "I know I have to think about the family as much as he's being fair about the Marines," she said. "We've talked a lot about that. We think we can make it work. You know how positive Kyle always is," she said. Dad agreed. He knew Kyle was always hopeful too. He looked at me. "Has she thought about this for a long time?" he asked. He put his hand on Jill's hand, showing he'd support her. I nodded and smiled. "Remember us playing soldier? She always made us call it playing Marines? Yeah. She's wanted this for a long time. Forever, really." Dad nodded and looked her in the eyes. "Your mom thought you'd want to do something like this. I'll tell her when she gets home from choir tonight." Jill's eyes sparkled. "Dad, I'm so grateful." She leaned over the table and hugged him. Now sitting at the table that awful morning, Dad nodded while I remembered. The room was quiet. A minute later, Kyle began recalling memories. Climbing Mount Fuji when he visited her in Okinawa, their trip to Tokyo, dealing with cockroaches at Camp Lejeune, swimming in a creek in North Carolina, and Kyle's promotion to chief editor. There were always more stories. It was bittersweet. There was a part of her we never knew, and it touched every happy memory. Love had a shadow. Jill's life ended with a question mark.
I'm Marge Devereaux. Dwight finally gave me an updated list of all the officers in the regiment, wives, living partners, family, everyone, in early April. He said no more officers would be moved around, so I had their addresses, emails, and phone numbers. I could contact the spouses of battalion commanders and officers, all wives and one husband. "You have a woman in the regiment?" I asked, surprised. We were eating dinner late again. He'd worked till 9. Most Tuesdays he worked late. "Oh yeah, she's in accounting. Just got major a year early, I think. Kinnison, Jill Kinnison. Got her last November, I believe." He was short and to the point, as he was when he didn't want to talk about something. I said, "Says here she's married." "Yeah, haven't met him yet. We should get everyone together, officer spouses anyway. Oh, she did say she didn't take his last name. I don't know what his is." He sounded a bit mocking at that last part. I looked at the paper. Kyle Franklin. Dwight hadn't mentioned he had a woman Marine assigned, especially one with a higher rank. She wasn't in combat, so she wasn't in the chain of command. Still, she'd been working with him in the logistics team for some time. I'll organize something, give me a date, and I want to talk to the wives of the battalion officers so they know what they can do to help, I said. I enjoyed seeing the families and children. Ike and I had decided not to have any kids, and I sometimes regretted it. Dwight looked at me, smiling. We went through this during the last war. Now you're the woman they'll look to. I know it's not an official rule, but, he said, it's appreciated. I know, I don't mind. It makes life in the Marines a bit easier. Otherwise, it can be lonely. He nodded. I thought, Jill Kinnison, huh? He was dismissive, unusually so. I didn't reach any conclusions, but I thought, not again. Dwight said nothing more as we finished our meal. Meeting go okay? I asked. He held meetings with his battalion commanders on Tuesday evenings. Yeah, they're excited about deployment. Henry, the 3rd Battalion leader, is so nervous he can't sleep, and since his wife left him, he's practically living at his work. I wonder how she's doing. Are they divorced? I asked. I didn't know Lily Henry very well, but I had met her. I knew she took the kids back to Pennsylvania and her parents, but not why. Being a Marine officer's wife was stressful. The wives of lower-ranked men had a lot of trouble, too, some living in trailers off base. But usually the battalion and company officers' wives looked in on them, to some degree. Sometimes. I decided I'd call Major Kinnison's husband. I was curious about what life was like for a Marine's husband. Think I'll call him, I said. Who? Colonel Henry, Dwight said. No, Major Kinnison's husband. I wonder what he thinks about deployment. It might be different for a husband, I said. Go ahead, Dwight said. We watched TV, and Dwight pressed his uniform for the next day, as he did many nights. I went upstairs and found a nightgown that I thought looked nice, but when I came downstairs, he acted like I might get cold. Sometimes Dwight showed little interest lately. I'm here if you want me, I told him. Usually, as he got ready for deployment, Ike would want to be close with me every day, sometimes even more. We used to laugh about it before his last trip. He'd come home, and I'd be hiding in a playful outfit, or without a top. Somehow he always found me. He grinned. You look so good. Tomorrow night, I promise. You know how long Tuesdays are, he said. I tried not to feel let down, but I missed him being close. Ayla Gilstrap, sister of Major Jill Kinnison, telling the story they weren't divorced. There was no time for that. Kyle found out Jill was cheating a week before she left. He was my friend, my brother-in-law, my buddy. I would have loved him if Jill hadn't, before Gil came along. They were that couple everyone knew were meant to be. If two people were fated, it was them. The idea of an affair was crazy. It was pointless. It crushed Kyle. I saw the light fade from his eyes as he fell into sadness in just a few seconds. It reminded me of the end of the second Terminator movie when the Terminator sank into the hot, molten metal. That was Kyle, sitting at our kitchen table that evening. But his sinking wasn't for a noble reason. It was because of a broken commitment. He never thought she'd hurt him like that. No one did. I didn't know pain could be that deep, and I wasn't even the one she hurt the most. For her pre-deployment leave, Jill and Kyle came to town on Thursday afternoon. Mom, Dad, and I met them on the porch as they carried their bags from the rental car. Gil was on the phone and would meet them inside. Mom, Dad, Jill said, rushing to hug both of them, then me. Ayla, you've gotten so thin, she said, looking me up and down. I have kids and work hard to stay slim. Kyle, with his charming smile, said, It's so good to be home. Mom, Dad. He hugged Mom and shook Dad's hand like he always did. Kyle had called our parents Mom and Dad since about the 4th grade, and it was never a joke or strange. We didn't even notice when he started. On the porch, he finally hugged me, and I felt the old feelings I'd never spoken of, not even to Gil. We went inside. About 20 old friends stopped by over the next 2 hours to chat and laugh and remember old times. There were new babies to see and old folks to remember, sports to talk about and stories to tell. We avoided talking about the war. No one wanted to think of Jill in danger. Some of the talk was funny. Some people joked that it was easier to reach Jill to give Kyle messages than to call him directly. Kyle just smiled. He probably didn't like cell phones much. He laughed loudly at all the things Jill's phone could do. 2 hours later, the terrible news came. The guests had left, food was put away, and dishes were cleaned and put in the dishwasher or sink. Gil went to pick up our girls from a friend's house. We were sitting around the table, Dad and Kyle drinking Bud, seltzer water for Mom and me. Mom and Dad were on one side, and Jill, Kyle, and I were on the other. When Jill excused herself to the bathroom, Kyle was saying, "I have a new job chance also working for a publishing house. I'll talk to Jill about it soon." Then her phone rang right in front of him. The regimental commander's name and rank showed on the screen. Kyle pushed a button casually while finishing his sentence to Mom and Dad, and a text popped up. "Missing you already. Can't forget Tuesday evening. Hope you're not feeling sore. Come back early and I'll make it worth your while." Kyle smiled at first, which was his usual reaction to almost anything, but he couldn't just brush this off. The smile twisted painfully on his lips. The message was shockingly suggestive, and he became serious quickly. I read it from beside him and gasped. It might have been innocent. "Wrong button," he muttered so only I could hear. "That looks like enough to search her messages." His voice sounded dry. Maybe he felt unsure. He looked at me, and I'll never forget his face as he battled with what to do, respect her privacy, or find the truth we both suspected and feared. He didn't speak for a moment as he thought. Finally, he said, looking into my eyes with a serious gaze, "I have to know now." He was calm. Mom and Dad must have been confused by our sudden private talk. They couldn't see the screen of the phone from across the table. Kyle went through Jill's text messages and saw many flirty and intimate texts from Colonel Dwight Devereaux. I put my hand on his arm but couldn't speak. It was unexpected. Awful. I always looked up to my little sister. I was proud of her athletic skills, her good grades, and her character. I was proud of her career in the Marines. She was so strong and good. Her love for Kyle seemed unshakable. Kyle switched to sent messages after finding the prompt and saw that Jill had suggested certain actions, talked about longing for his touch, a recent one about taking my last innocence, and many arranging meetings. Kyle slumped. I held his left arm with both my hands, squeezing hard. A tear escaped my eye. Jill came back as he read a message from that very day that hoped they'd be able to meet in the war zone. Jill saw my hands around Kyle's arm and tears on my face and froze at the change in mood. She saw him fumbling with her phone. "Ah, here it is," he said, finding the off button. The screen went dark. He stood up then and handed it to Jill. Colonel Devereaux texted. "He'd like you to return early," he said, looking at Jill with a strange smile. "Maybe you should." He suddenly took control of the room, and I noticed he did not give anyone a chance to speak. He turned to Mom and Dad. "Mr. and Mrs. Kinnison," he said formally, bowing his head a little. "Thank you for the welcome. It was wonderful." The formal tone made Jill worried, but with Kyle, she thought it might be a joke. It actually showed he had made a decision. Mom and Dad looked surprised, and maybe thought they had upset him somehow. They started to speak, but Kyle raised a hand and shook his head. He said, "I'm afraid I can't stay here now. Isla, can you explain after I'm gone?" He looked at me, struggling to keep calm. He was pleading with his eyes. I nodded, and knew our lives wouldn't be the same again. He said, "Thanks." He glanced at Jill for a brief moment, the last time he would see her. I saw the sadness in his eyes and the confusion in hers. He shook his head, reached out and touched her cheek with 3 fingers. She asked, sounding confused, "Kyle, what's going on?" Her voice was like a little girl's again. He dropped his hand, turned and left. Since they had just arrived home, their bags were still in the living room. He picked up 2 and walked out without a second thought. His exit took only a few seconds. The whole scene took about 30 seconds. It was a sad, yet graceful departure. I looked at my sister. She seemed both confused and angry at being ignored by her husband. I hated her at that moment. She had always been his priority, but now it was clear she did not feel the same about him anymore. I shook my head. "He read your text with the colonel," I said. I looked at Mom and Dad. "She's been having an affair with him." Kyle saw their messages. Mom jumped up, shocked, saying no. Her chair crashed into the refrigerator. Her hands were clasped in frustration. I'd never seen her so shocked. Jill cried out, "Ah," and tried to get around the table, but Mom and her chair blocked one way. Kyle's chair blocked the other. By the time Jill got around, ran through the living room and opened the door, Kyle was backing the car out. "Kyle, Kyle, Kyle," she called, reminding me of the many mornings she would call him for breakfast. This time he did not respond. Her calls became sadder as he drove away, turning down the street and disappearing around the bend. She called out in grief, realizing she had lost him. She stood there for a moment, holding the door open and staring into the dark. Then she lowered her head and came back inside. She faced our unhappy parents and me, a sibling who felt almost as much betrayal as her husband did. She looked at me and said, Why did he open my phone? She assumed his respect for her would shield her from discovery. She thought his goodness would hide her wrongdoing. I shook my head. Your text alert went off. I think Kyle tried to silence it but accidentally opened it. Then he had to know. I saw a flicker of pain in her eyes when I mentioned her lover. I stood up, unable to hold back my anger. How could you? I asked loudly with gritted teeth. I had never spoken to her with such anger. Our past fights were nothing compared to this. She looked down and shook her head, then sat down. I said, we took him in since he was 6. He had no one else. He was always with us. He was family, our family. Kyle was our almost brother. Betraying him meant betraying our family. It felt so natural when he and Jill grew up together, got married. They seemed perfect for each other. How could our family survive without Kyle? How could it function now with Jill? We all sat quietly for a long time. Jill's face was stone-like, showing no emotion. Mom was staring for a while, leaning on Dad. Tears ran down my cheeks. Someone groaned. Dad shook his head after a few minutes and spoke to Jill in a calm, clear but hard voice. We watched you 3 grow up together. It was one of the best parts of our lives. He looked at Mom, and she nodded. She was still with us. We thought we taught you about being good and loyal. Kyle was part of our family. He called me Dad and never asked for anything in return. He shook his head with a small, sad smile, thinking of the happy moments now lost. He continued, if anyone was one with another, you were. That boy never thought of loving anyone else but you, Jill. He missed you all through your time in Okinawa, those temporary duties, weekend work, living alone mostly, going to school, working in military housing, waiting for you. He was heartbroken by your miscarriage and that you went through it alone. He chose a job that matched your tough one. If he ever complained, I never heard it. I've never seen a man so in love with a woman. Never. Jill nodded because it was clearly true. She knew what he was talking about. Dad was furious, trying hard to keep calm. He had never been violent, probably never thought of it. He was shaking while holding Mom. I'm so sorry, Jill whispered. The Marine major looked like a child again, her eyes dark and looking down. She was 31. It was all she could say. It was a regret. Dad said, you Marines make a big deal out of your motto, saying it to everyone, shortening it. But you betrayed the person most loyal to you. I never... He struggled to go on. He gathered himself, still angry. His voice was a forceful whisper. I never ever want to hear you say Semper Fi to someone. Do you hear me? Never. Jill looked up at that. She had always thought of the motto, always faithful, as just for the Marines, and their belief that keeps soldiers going in battle. Dad saw it differently. To him, always faithful meant always. You don't get to choose when to be good. I think Dad helped her see things in a new way. She had a look on her face like she just realized something. I think she learned something important in that moment. Mom was calm. Dad put his arm around her and she leaned her head on his shoulder. This was rare for them. Mom said, it was pride. I was too proud. We sat in hard silence for what felt like 5 or 6 minutes. We all felt a heavy sadness. We had never felt a loss like this before. Our family lost some of its innocence that night. We were supposed to be the good ones. Other kids lied and stole, but Mom believed that we didn't. Now she wasn't so sure. She felt like she had failed as a mother. She thought her efforts to be a good mom had not worked. She felt that any wrong her adult daughter did was her fault. Mom looked at me, maybe because I had my own kids. I'll never give advice to another mother again, she said. Jill looked as if she'd been slapped. Jill left the table without a word and went to her old room. She slept in her travel clothes, or maybe just her underwear, probably because she didn't want to see anyone by going to the living room to get her bags. Later, Mom and I talked about it while Dad listened, trying to calm down. We wondered if Kyle would still feel like part of the family, or if he would pull away. After midnight, I remembered I had work the next morning, so I went home and told Gil what happened. Gil shook his head. It's hard to believe, he said. He hugged me, thinking about what this all meant. Kyle will never be the same, he said. Gil was close to Kyle. Not as close as I was, but very close for 2 different people. Nothing will ever be the same again, I said. Kyle was deeply hurt, and I thought he would feel very sad for a while. I always felt that Jill made him happy. I couldn't imagine him happy without her. I hoped he would get through the sadness and come out stronger. I wanted him to find happiness even without Jill. Maybe Jill was just the first big love of his life. Nobody had much to say to Jill for the rest of her visit. It was like a dark cloud hung over us, making everything hard. I could escape by going home to my girls and Gil. We told the kids that Aunt Jill came home, but Uncle Kyle had to go away suddenly. They were used to them being away. Jill stayed the whole visit, maybe hoping Kyle would come to talk to her. I saw her crying several times. Once she sat with me in the living room and said, "Mom talked to me." "Oh, how did that go?" I asked. Jill's eyes filled with tears and one fell. She asked me how could someone not love Kyle enough to stay faithful. "And what did you say?" I asked. "I said I didn't know," Jill replied. Mom said, "Oh, Jill, you're still protecting your affair." She then left the room, shaking her head like she thought I was lying. I'm trying to figure out what she meant. I didn't say anything. Mom used her mind to think about kids, love, and family instead of getting a degree. She was smart in a caring, everyday way. There are different kinds of being smart. I think Mom is as smart as Gil and Kyle, and I know they agree. Jill was just starting to see this. Jill tried calling Kyle at least once every day. He answered, but didn't talk. Once Jill started speaking about it, he hung up. I was with her during her last try from our old home. She stood by the kitchen table. "Come home, Kyle," Jill said tiredly. "I need to explain," she said. "I have to leave tomorrow." She held the phone to her ear and looked at me, finally shrugging. She heard nothing, or maybe just his breathing. "I'm so sorry, Kyle, so sorry." She hung up. I said nothing at first. I saw her slowly lower the phone to the table. Her shoulders slumped. She didn't move for a minute. I took a seat at the kitchen table. "I don't know what to do," she said, sitting down. She put her face in her hands. No tears came out. "Sometimes you cry so much that no more tears come. Now you're going back to your lover. There's nothing for him to do, nothing to say." She groaned. I felt anger, not pity. Dad walked into the room then. He sat down with us, looking older. She looked at Dad. "I don't know what to do. I've ruined the most important relationship of my life." He shook his head and paused. "Really? You don't know what to do? Your mother has been here for you every day of your life, and you can't think of what to do now that you've made a big mistake?" He looked into her eyes, and for once she looked back. "You know exactly what to do if you're strong enough. Do what a good person would do after hurting the one they love. Do what's right." Jill looked at him. "Do you all hate me?" This time he answered right away. "No. Haven't you figured out how love works? You had all of us and Kyle. Your life isn't over. Hopefully his isn't either. I doubt you can make it up to him, but living well from now on might make your life as good as it can be," he said. "I just hope you haven't broken him."
Jill was in Afghanistan about 3 months when she died. I wondered if she was with Devereaux during those months, if she saw him at night, or if he found her. War was probably a perfect cover for cheaters, I thought. Sure, I'll simplify the text and remove any sexually suggestive content while maintaining the story and emotion. Of course, I only knew about modern combat from what Jill's few emails said or what I saw on the news. She worked at a forward operating base, FOB, helping with logistics tasks. She wasn't actually fighting, but there was still danger from things like rocket-propelled grenades, attacks, IEDs, and ambushes. I guessed the colonel was in the same FOB. Did their relationship continue? Did other officers or Marines ignore it or even gossip about it? Were they jealous of the colonel being close to the major? Jill once mentioned in an email that she told him it was over. I wondered if that was true. I wondered if Devereaux had other relationships or just this one. I met Devereaux once before deployment. It started with a call from his wife. "Hello, Kyle Franklin?" I heard a woman's voice on the phone. It was early April, a month before deployment, and I was editing a bad writer's story. "Yes, this is Kyle," I replied. "Good. This is Marge Devereaux, Colonel Devereaux's wife. Your wife Jill works in his headquarters," she explained. "Yes, Mrs. Devereaux, how can I help you?" "Well, actually, you're the only husband of a woman Marine in the regiment, and I wanted to check up. And we talked for a long time. She was very nice, and I felt she cared a lot about her husband's success. I assured her I would stay on base most of the deployment. I did have 1 or 2 commitments, but I would be reachable by email or phone. "I hope you come to the officers' family gathering later this month," she said. "It'll be a chance to meet Ike and some of the men your wife works with. It's the week before leave." "I wouldn't miss it," I said. The gathering was informal. From second lieutenants to Colonel Devereaux, the officers and their families met under a pavilion on a bright, warm Saturday in April. Kids were playing, and hot dogs and beer were available. Most Marines wore desert camis. Jill and I walked around, meeting some of the officers she worked with or over until we met Mrs. Devereaux and the colonel. Jill said, Mrs. Devereaux, I'm Jill Kinnison. I work in your husband's office. They shook hands, and Mrs. Devereaux said, Marge, call me Marge. So good to finally meet you, Major. Marge was blonde, about 40, attractive but not flashy. Her smile was genuine, her handshake friendly. My husband, Kyle Franklin, Jill introduced me as the colonel looked over. He stared at me, then shook my hand. My wife introduced me to her friend, and I noticed nothing. Mr. Franklin, he said. He grabbed my hand firmly. Good to meet you, Colonel, I almost gasped. So happy to have Major Kinnison with us, he said. She runs her group very well. She's been a great addition to the unit, helped fix the supply issues. He looked at me as if judging me and not very impressed. He was 6 inches taller than I was. Jill's sharp, no doubt about it. I smiled, and she punched me in the arm playfully. Marge said, You can always call me if there's any problem, Kyle, or if you have a question. Make sure you get the list of numbers, and I'll email you everything as the deployment goes on. Good. Are you planning any family gatherings during the deployment? I think I missed one when I was at school in February, I said. Oh, you're going to school? She asked. I teach at writers' workshops sometimes. I was at Wake Forest that week, I replied. It was my 3rd Wake Forest symposium. Kyle's an editor. He works with various book publishers, Jill said. I noticed Devereaux look at me differently, as if I might be useful after all. Maybe he thought about writing a book someday. Yes, as to the gatherings, but just informal things. I will be in touch, Kyle, Marge said, turning to another couple who just walked over. The colonel said, I'll need to talk with you later, Major. Better yet, I'll just text. Yes, sir, Jill said. Others were waiting for the colonel's attention, so we politely left. What did you think? Jill asked. I think he crushed my hand, I said, flexing it. She laughed. Yeah, he's known for that. The enlisted men call him Iron Ike for it. He's an arrogant guy. I'm surprised you get along with him so well, I said. He was showing off. Jill said, They're all like that. No one wants a commander who doubts themselves in combat. He's good at his job, at least in supply and finances. I nodded. We went over to talk with some company commanders and their families who were closer to our ages. There were kids everywhere, and it was a pleasant gathering. During my 3-month withdrawal from society, many times I thought back to that picnic. I wondered if there were signs that Jill and Devereaux were close. Did anyone roll their eyes at me? Did anyone know? Was I a joke to the regiment? I saw no hint in Marge's eyes. Maybe some of Devereaux's arrogance came from knowing a secret. It's hard for a proud man to keep a secret without it affecting his ego. I got 4 emails from Jill during her deployment. They were carefully written because someone else might read them. The first was a short story of her time there, with details left out, and I saved it in a new folder. It said the relationship started shortly after Devereaux and she met. That surprised me. She didn't mention the miscarriage. Jill had a miscarriage after Christmas. Was it related to the relationship she had mentioned? Suddenly the whole affair felt even darker as I thought about it in my hotel room. That letter ended with her saying she only spoke to the colonel for work matters now. She wrote, I told him our affair was over. I didn't explain much, just said I wouldn't talk about it anymore and he should leave it alone. He doesn't know you found out or that we are separated. He won't know. I'm trying my best to face what I did and face this war. I want my parents to look at me with pride again. Maybe someday. The second email was an apology. She asked me to think about saving our marriage. She talked about her feelings, her mistake, and how she didn't love him. She said it was only physical, never love. He never thought of leaving his wife, she wrote, and I never wanted to risk our marriage. We didn't think we would get caught. Maybe the Marines made Jill proud like this. The third and fourth letters were short. Jill wrote about her job and the dangers she faced. Each letter ended with her saying she still loved me and hoped she didn't ruin our relationship. The fourth letter ended with, I doubt our relationship can ever be like it was before. It was all my fault, but that doesn't mean it can't be good and worthy. Did her colonel read her letters? Was he with her as she clicked send? Like the first 2, I put these in the folder labeled Jill. I was furious. I hated her, him, the Marines, the war, everything. I didn't want to think about loving Jill. Was she with other Marines? How did she get through Okinawa alone for a year if she couldn't control herself when I was with her? We used a diaphragm to prevent pregnancy because Jill didn't want to take pills. When she got pregnant, I thought we had just been unlucky or too excited. She told me at a restaurant. She was teary and emotional. I thought it was the surprise that made her cry, and she said they were happy tears. I thought she was just emotional because of the pregnancy. She was 5 or 6 weeks along and said she was happy about the baby, but sorry she had to miss her scheduled deployment. I thought it was her hormones. She was very emotional in the days that followed, crying for no reason at night. She planned to tell her colonel at 8 weeks and start the process to leave her job. Pregnant majors didn't go to war zones. Her duties went on, including an unexpected trip to California. She lost the baby during the 7th week while on that temporary duty in early January. She was teaching a seminar to enlisted men at Camp Pendleton and had to face it alone. She was only supposed to be gone for 10 days, leaving on a Thursday and coming back the next Sunday. She called me that Monday evening to say she felt sick and was going to bed. Then she bled, had cramps. She went to the bathroom crying in the middle of the night, she said. She lost our baby in the toilet. She had a procedure at a civilian hospital the next morning and called to tell me the sad news that afternoon and to say she would fly to RDU the next morning for a few days of rest. Could I meet her plane? Someone else would handle the seminar. She was alone for all that, so far away with no one she knew to help her. If she had called, I would have flown out there, and Ayla or her mother would have too. The first I knew about it was after the procedure. That was when I realized how independent and strong Jill was. I was sad as I called her dad, but proud of how she could handle such a personal problem alone. We were strong, though. One miscarriage was bad luck. We would get past it. Every memory felt suspicious now. Was all that a plan? Was the baby mine? Was she unfaithful that early? I couldn't remember the first mention in her phone, and the letter didn't give details. I counted back the months, the weeks. The miscarriage at 6 or 7 weeks, about 7 or 8 after she joined the 6th Marines. She had known the colonel a week or so when she probably got pregnant. Could it have been his baby? So soon? Was it all an act? Temporary duty, trip to California, leading a workshop, phone calls, miscarriage, to fool me? Did I grieve for another man's child? If a marriage becomes 2 separate lives, it's worse for both people. I thought of her with Devereaux and knew I would always feel less in her eyes. With the news of her death and that morning of coffee and memories, I felt deep sadness. The Kinnisons went back to bed and Ayla went home to tell her daughters that Aunt Jill was dead. I stayed on the couch trying to sleep but couldn't. Disconnected memories appeared. I saw her diving for grounders, throwing to first, running down a runner, and tagging someone at the plate. I remembered how she shook after sliding her mom's car into a parked car on an icy day just after getting her license. After my grandma died, she rested her head on my shoulder and let me cry. I remembered her smiling when I gave her the diamond ring when we got engaged, the ring too small to fit her finger. I remembered our first time being close like that after she turned 18. It was a warm memory. I thought we would last forever. I was sure I was first, even if I wasn't last. I lay on the couch, thinking, unable to sleep. I would sell her car, give her clothes to Goodwill. I would need to leave Camp Lejeune, find a place for myself. I'd probably move to Columbus to be near the Zenger offices there since I had accepted their job offer. My role would change in September or October. Suddenly, I remembered I had a business to take care of. I sat up and grabbed my phone. Murray had to know. I sent her a text. Mo, Jill was killed a few days ago in Afghanistan. Everything's a mess here. Could you let Sharon know? Thanks a lot. You're a star. I had already given Murray a lot of work these past 3 months, and now this. I got a reply in seconds. Oh no, I'm so sorry, Kyle. Call anytime. I'll tell Sharon.
I'm Penny Kinnison, Jill's mother. Jill and Kyle weren't just married. They felt like one person. Their relationship made them better people together. They were more than just 2 individuals, as Gil once said. Now Jill was gone and Kyle was broken. Kyle arrived around 6:30 the morning we got the news about Jill's death. He knocked, and Ayla went to let him in. He could have come in since the door was unlocked, but he had changed after learning about her affair. It broke my heart to see him like that. There would be no fixing things, no forgiveness, no Jill and Kyle anymore. Ayla and Kyle hugged at the door for a long time, whispering. They were very close. Dan and I let them have their moment. Kyle looked so sad. He was clean-shaven but had dark circles from lack of sleep. His clothes looked rumpled but clean. Finally, they walked into the living room, Isla holding his hand. I gave him a long hug. Dan came over and put his hand on Kyle's shoulder. Kyle cried mostly silent tears. I said, "She loved you, Kyle. No matter what mistakes she made, she died loving you." He just nodded. Kyle made himself a cup of coffee and then joined us. He leaned back on the couch. Dan and I held hands and just stared into space, wishing it wasn't real. Ayla sat in a chair, lost in her thoughts and sipping her coffee. We shared stories about Jill and the kids growing up. "I think Gil would have loved playing with us as kids," Kyle said. Ayla laughed. The idea of the small round guy running with them, always being part of the games, was funny. Gil was fun. He loved everything social but wasn't good at sports. He said he always felt a bit out of place because he was a year ahead in school. "I'm always the first one tagged in every game," he'd say. When it came to women, Gil was unsure at first, but then he was grateful for Ayla. Ayla had actually asked him out on their first date. He probably didn't think he had a chance with her before that. I remembered once, before they got engaged, Gil stood in the kitchen and asked her, "What do you see in me?" He sounded so surprised. It broke my heart until Ayla answered. She stood up, put her arms around him and said, "It's no mystery. You're the smartest, kindest man I've ever known." Gil stared at her, believed she meant it, and kissed her right there in front of Dan and me. It was the longest, most heartfelt kiss I ever saw from them. "Yeah," I said, leaving that memory for another time. "Every kid in town used to cut through our yards. Why not Gil too?" Kyle looked over. "I always meant to say sorry for running through your flowers, but Ayla was about to tag me and—" I laughed for the first time that day. Maybe the only time. "Jill was so proud of you, Kyle," Dan said, "when you got promoted to editor. She called us from her office just to tell us." Kyle looked surprised. "I didn't know she called you." We all nodded, feeling both sad and happy. "We had some good times," Kyle said, trying to see the bright side. I hoped his positive outlook was coming back. They had been such a wonderful couple with so many nice moments. Later that afternoon, Ayla and Gil brought the girls over. We had all taken naps, Kyle on the couch, Ayla after she went home to tell the girls that Aunt Jill was gone. When their car pulled up, Kyle and I went out on the porch to meet them. I held Kyle's arm. It just felt like he needed to be supported. The girls walked up and hugged Kyle, whom they hadn't seen for a few months, and then they hugged me. Their eyes were red from crying. Gil came up the steps holding Ayla's hand and then let it go to hold Kyle's. "How are you doing, buddy?" Gil asked. Kyle said nothing, overwhelmed again, just shaking his head. "You're one of us, always, you know," Gil said. It was a phrase he often used, meaning different things at different times. Now it meant he shared the same sadness. Gil hugged me. "A sad and awful day," he said. Kyle and Gil were best friends. They were different but complemented each other well. Each brought people together. Kyle lost some of his competitive nature with Gil because he enjoyed being with him. Gil found a less nerdy but still smart friend he didn't have before. They hardly noticed that Kyle could beat Gil easily in tennis, or that Gil could win Kyle's car in poker. They still played both games sometimes. In tennis, Kyle might forget the score when he played Gil, because it was more about keeping the rally going than winning. And in poker, they agreed no money or property would ever change hands. During college, they became allies, chasing the sisters and staying friends. Kyle asked Gil to be his best man, saying, "I need to find a way to get you in the pictures." I remembered Ayla and Jill talking about it once when Jill and Kyle were home before her trip to Okinawa. We were at the park, watching them finish their tennis game before lunch. Look at them. They play and don't care who wins. Kyle is different around Gil, Jill said. Ayla nodded. "Yeah, and Gil, it's like he's finally found someone who isn't a nerd but still gets him," Ayla said, smiling with Jill. I nodded in agreement. "You know," I added, "we're really proud of the guys you girls married." A few months later, Gil was recognized for his papers on the Gilstrap eigenvectors permutations, which he published at Chapel Hill. UNC awarded him for them. Engineering companies often hired him under his company name, and he made some money. I didn't know you could be a freelance mathematician, but Gil seemed to manage just fine. He was always there to help with the girls. Kyle also worked online for some publishing contractor. It was hard to figure out what he did. He always talked about Sharon, Nelson and Mo, who were his co-workers. By his late 20s, he was working directly under the company president. He once said, "She's preparing me to run the company in a few years." Jill and he were not struggling for money, but they weren't rich either. Not a lot of money in being a book editor for a small company. Enough, though, Kyle said. For now. Ayla found some of Kyle's articles in magazines. She showed me one about To Kill a Mockingbird. I didn't know how deeply he had read that book. He was comfortable in the publishing world. Kyle, who used to destroy my flowers instead of getting tagged, had become an intellectual for a living. Kyle was proud of Gil, proud to be his brother-in-law. It was mutual respect. Gil loved being at the table with all of us, and now with his daughters included. He was used to people thinking he was too nerdy or smart. But it didn't matter in our family. Gil was welcome, thanks to Ayla and Kyle. Kyle brought competitiveness and brotherhood to our family. But Kyle also had a tough childhood. He had a deep insecurity. I think he lacked confidence in himself. I believed Jill saw it. Ayla did. We talked about it many times before and after Jill and Kyle married. And maybe she saw it as a flaw. I saw it as something good in him. I should have talked to Jill openly about it. I thought it made Kyle more sensitive, in a kind and compassionate way. He was strong and determined, but he had a rare depth of feeling. Kyle was compassionate. He cried openly when Jill miscarried as he talked to Dan and me on the phone, feeling guilty for not being with Jill during that awful time. Dan was moved. He talked about how good and loving Kyle was to Jill, and I agreed. Almost every decision was for Jill's benefit. Where to live, what car to buy, what was best for her career, etc. She noticed his care and always acted lovingly toward him. He was devastated when he discovered her affair. Maybe he blamed himself for not being a good enough husband. That would be his way. Somehow he felt he'd let her down. He was quiet for the months Jill was deployed. Ayla believed he might be drinking. I hoped he was not turning to drinking or casual relationships. Those can have lasting impacts. Ayla just shrugged when I shared those fears. I didn't know why Jill had the affair. Her moral failure felt like mine as a mother. I believed my children should be good, were good. I wanted them to be the good ones in any situation. I welcomed my grandchildren to our home when we learned of her death. They were red-eyed and not themselves. I kissed my surviving daughter. "I'm Malin Pinckney Franklin Robeson Eddy Kyle's mother, Thomas. I was trying to reach my ex, my first ex, Tom Franklin." "Yeah. Who? Mally." "I'd know that voice anywhere," Thomas said. He hated that I called him Thomas, which was why I did it. He hadn't heard from me since Kyle's wedding, so he ignored it. "Tom, I have some bad news. Kyle just called me." "Are you there?" I said. He was very quiet, which for Thomas usually meant he was asleep or busy. "Yeah, Mally, bad news." "What?" I heard his heavy breathing and guessed he was busy. "Kyle's wife, Jill. She was killed with the Marines. Remember she was in the Marines?" "Oh no," he said. I knew that would get his attention. Thomas might have a hard time focusing during a busy moment, but he would wake up at the news of a death. He and I had watched Kyle play with Jill and her sister growing up. When we divorced, I got Kyle and stayed in Sky Grey with him. But my mum really raised Kyle. I moved away for work and remarriage, and I decided his friends were the most stable part of his life. When Mum volunteered to care for him, it worked out. I never saw him without Jill or her sister with him, and the Kinnisons treated him like a son too. "How's Kyle handling it?" he asked, saying the right thing for once. He was calm on the phone. He said she and he were separated. I don't know why, but she died. He'll let us know more in a few days, probably. "I always liked Jill," he said. "Remember when she saw me that once? Not in my boxers." He laughed sadly, remembering standing in the kitchen with a little girl at the back door, then stopped with a catch in his voice, a choked-up sob. Tom felt the loss, and I remembered why I had loved him. "Why didn't he call me himself?" Thomas asked after he regained control. "His number for you is old. I got this one from your girlfriend, the one you brought to the wedding. Bree Lynn." "Bree! Yes, I remember her now." He paused, maybe thinking. "Awful, huh, Mally?" I remember Jill waking me up calling his name so many mornings. She was a good kid. He paused for a few seconds. We didn't have much of a marriage, but... He began and then stopped. Yeah, but Kyle came out of it, and Jill was a cutie. I'll give him your number. Oh, do you have a pen? His number is...
I only knew one person who died. It happened in February during my second year in college. Grandma, are you home? I usually came back from Miami U most Fridays to spend weekends at Grandma's and see Jill. Grandma always knew I was coming. She would have cookies and milk or coffee ready. We'd chat at the kitchen table about school, Jill, or Mom and Dad. She was expecting me, but when I called out, she didn't answer. Grandma? Grandma? It was odd for her not to reply. She was one of those older ladies who always kept her home in order. No one entered without her knowing. I found her lying on the kitchen floor. Grandma, please, Grandma, I shouted, knowing she couldn't hear me. I wasn't panicking. I knew it was too late. Her eyes were open. She wasn't breathing, and her eyes were lifeless. There was no blood. I was sure it was her heart. I knelt beside her. She felt cold. I kissed her forehead, but it was icy. Ah, Grandma, I said softly and sat down heavily next to her, my hand on her hair. I leaned against the cabinet. It took me a moment to move. I called Mom while sitting beside Grandma. Mom told me what to do after she understood Grandma was really gone and CPR wouldn't help. I called 911 and told the woman that Grandma had passed away. Police and paramedics would come, she said. She wanted me to stay on the phone until the police arrived. I opened the front door and didn't care about letting the cold air in. I went back to Grandma and sat beside her again, my left hand gently stroking her hair and cheek. Soon, I heard a siren outside, and then a woman called out, "Police!" I told the 911 lady, "The police are here," and I hung up. I called out, "In the kitchen, officer." She found us, saw Grandma with my hand on her head, and her face softened. "I found her like this, officer, just a few minutes ago." I kissed Grandma on the forehead one last time and stood up. I called Jill, who was walking home from high school. Her parents came over shortly after seeing the police car and its lights. The paramedics arrived then. Jill joined us on the front porch in the cold winter sun. We didn't say much. I cried with Jill's head on my shoulder. Dan Kinnison put his hand on my shoulder. Grandma left me her savings, her house, and her rarely used car. I wasn't rich, but suddenly I could pay off student loans, afford graduate school, and feel secure. I would have given it all away to have Grandma back. She raised me more than Mom had. She made me feel worth her time, worth the last of her time. Since Jill was 2 years younger than me and I didn't have a job lined up after I got my bachelor's in English, I signed up for a master's program at a unique school in Cincinnati. I finished it in 18 months, focusing while Jill was on her summer marine cruises. 5 months before she finished her degree, I had a master's in literature. The next few months were busy. We planned a wedding, our future, and loved each other. People saw it. It was the first thing anyone noticed about us. We didn't hide it. Our love was clear even though our life together was private. She graduated with a degree in accounting, became a second lieutenant in the Marine Corps Reserve, married me, moved into Grandma's house with me for a month, and then moved to Quantico, renting an apartment nearby. I stayed in Ohio for another week, sold Grandma's house to the same police officer who responded to my 911 call, and then joined Jill in Dumfries, Virginia. We made the Marine Corps work for us. Jill had training that first year, the basic school all new Marine officers went to, followed by a school in her field. I applied for writing workshops and seminars during those busy times. The workshop I attended in late autumn led to my first job in writing and shaped my career. It was the third week of a 6-week workshop at Duke when the director, Sharon Ackerman, approached me. Her experience included work with several book publishers. She asked to meet me at Starbucks one morning in Durham. "Your paper on To Kill a Mockingbird is being talked about by the instructors," Dr. Ackerman said. "Barnum wants to publish it next month." I thought my essay, Mockingbird and a Child's Heart, was simple. I wondered why it hadn't been graded with the others at the start of the second week. Barnum's literary monthly was well respected. It focused on established novels, not new ones. I was glad my coffee wasn't too sweet. "Is it controversial?" I asked. "No, just a new way of looking at the novel, one that hasn't been considered before," she replied. "And in this business, fresh ideas are rare." I thought it was a regular essay praising the book's themes and language. Most ideas came from others, I said. I think the notes show that clearly. I was defensive. I didn't understand why she wanted to meet. No other students had been invited to breakfast. She smiled. I understand you're cautious. When you write something, you open yourself up to comments from everyone, including anonymous people. Today, though, I'm here to ask if you'll come to the spring event at Wake Forest. We'd love for you to present and give feedback. Maybe lead some groups. She sipped her large, sugary, milky drink. I sipped my big, dark coffee with just enough cream and a bit of stevia. I smiled, understanding she was offering me a job. Are you asking me to be a teacher? Yes, with close help. You'll be the only one without a PhD. Actually, you'll be my assistant. You'll give feedback in our small groups at Wake Forest and do a presentation on James Jones's books that you've read. And we want you to share your ideas from your Mockingbird paper. We've been very impressed with your reviews of Miss Malone's short story and Mr. Katudnik. Did I say that right? Katudnik's essay on James Jones's Some Came Running. Does it pay? I asked. I was living in a student dorm at Duke during the week and driving 4 hours back to Dumfries to see Jill every weekend. But Jill was worth the trip. Saturdays and Sundays were wonderful that fall. Yes, not much. You'll help me a lot, and I'm hoping you'll join us in a new project. We'll talk about that later, after the Wake Forest event. Do you have a master's degree? Yes, in literature, from the Union Institute in Cincinnati. She nodded. Good. I know Union, not exactly mainstream. I might have a job for you if all goes well. You could work from home, wherever that may be. There might be some travel, but not often. I nodded. My wife's a second lieutenant in the Marines. She expects to go to Camp Lejeune after Quantico. She shook her head. That's tough. My husband was in the Navy after medical school. 6 years? Any kids? I shook my head. No, we're waiting until she's in her 30s. Then we'll see. Dr. Ackerman nodded and sipped. I took a gulp of my still warm coffee. Well, after this workshop, I'd like to send you stories for editing sometimes. A way to introduce you to working with publishers. Then, after Wake Forest, we'll see about full-time work. We'll take it slow to get you more experience, she said. I was excited. I'd like that, Doctor, I said. It sounds interesting, and it's what I was hoping for, honestly. She nodded and finished her drink. Barnum's published my essay under a different title that December. It got some praise and some disagreement. Mr. Barnum was very happy with the comments and interest. Dr. Ackerman sent me a message. The essay is a success. Some of my students are debating it. One even called you a fatuous old slob of a nobody. I told him that wasn't the kind of criticism we encouraged. I said, he's not old at all. I laughed when I read that. Thanks for standing up for me, I replied. I knew she was laughing in Chapel Hill. Please edit the attached story. Take your time. Correct grammar and include an essay discussing characters, plot, and other elements. Isla found my essay on Barnum's online. I think she Googled my name, and the essay, now called New Perspectives on Lee's Mockingbird, came up. She sent me an email. Mom and Dad are proud to see you're finally doing something they understand and earning some money? I replied. Not much money so far, but I may have a real job editing soon. Fingers crossed. I took the job seriously. I found myself giving feedback and critiques to hopeful authors. Somehow, Dr. Ackerman got a hold of their papers, either in class or through a publisher. I was an editor who could give honest opinions for her, and the authors wouldn't know it was me. Each time I got feedback on my work from Dr. Ackerman. I felt worn out after many of these feedback sessions. I took every criticism to heart, and finally, I told Dr. Ackerman. She responded with a long email about how she was building a new type of business and wanted me to be part of it. I understand about the criticism. That's how all authors feel. But I have big plans for you if you can stick it out, she said. I'm very pleased with your progress. I learned that good writing was very hard. It wasn't just pouring out thoughts. Good writing was hard work, and it didn't always bring success. As Jill's time at Quantico was ending, I went to the Wake Forest event for writers, a week of meetings and small group talks. I gave lectures on my ideas about To Kill a Mockingbird and James Jones's war novels. I gave quick feedback on various short essays in meetings with the authors, mostly my own age or older, some much older. How old are you, Kyle? Dr. Ackerman asked. 25, just, I said. She was quiet. I think that'll work, she said. Dr. Murray was impressed with your Jones lecture, Dr. Ackerman told me. Good. I don't remember a Murray, I said. I had talked to 15 men and 1 young woman, and they had criticized every statement. It was another kind of challenge. She was the woman, Dr. Ackerman said. Her eyes were twinkling. I stopped, surprised. She could see my disbelief. She's a PhD? What is she, 15? I asked. I remembered her because it was unusual for a young woman to be interested in war novels, and I thought she was a bright undergraduate. When I met her, she had just shared her name, and I thought she was too young to be in this event. I literally thought she was 15, but she sure knew the novels. Ackerman laughed. She's 22, a very close family friend of mine. Brilliant. Maureen Murray. Call her Mo. The only thing holding her back is she needs more time to read more literature. She got her PhD 2 months ago at UNC. I remembered that Gil was there then for his award. I'm surprised, I said. She looked so young, pretty, tiny, but a spark in her eyes. She said that the thin red line was an allegory. She laughed. You'll get used to her. I want her to work with you in a few months. So I found a job in my field. It grew fast over time. Sharon Ackerman might have been a big woman, but she moved fast and smoothly as she built her company. Dr. Murray and I became online co-workers, and I enjoyed our work talks. I want you to take over someday, Sharon told me. Not too soon, I hope, I replied. She smiled. Kyle, you're 28, and you've made this company your early career. Now, we have 9 other editors. Our company, Professional Publications Underwriters, is doing very well. But my health isn't great, and my husband wants me to slow down. So I'd like you to take over most of my supervisory duties in the next 2 years. You'll be managing senior editor. This means fewer authors for you to edit, but you'll oversee the other editors and keep the company on track. What about Mo? What about Nelson? Nelson's too old and set in his ways. He avoids tough conversations and lets authors go too long without feedback. This upsets some agents. Mo isn't ready yet. She's 25, looks really young, and needs time to grow socially. She suggested you take this role for that reason. Mo. It was easy to see her as a kid, but she had a wisdom that few have. Her writing was not just good. I thought she'd write a great novel someday. We talked weekly by phone, texted daily about manuscripts, and met online to discuss work. Mo is special, I said. I'd known her for 3 years, but only through work. She never talked about personal stuff. Sharon nodded thoughtfully. Mo had lived with Sharon during college and her teenage years. They had a close bond, almost like family. Sharon stayed close to Mo's parents, who were also academics. Remember how I had you handle the Smith matter? She asked. I remembered well. It was just 2 months ago. Barb Smith had written a good novel about the Civil War. Sharon assigned the book to one of our editors, Nancy Willensong. Nancy was around 38, attractive, and married with 3 kids. Barb and Nancy met secretly and became involved. Nancy's husband sued us. I had to handle it. I fired Nancy for breaking her agreement with us, canceled the contract with the book's publisher, and the lawsuit was dropped. We then changed our policy to forbid personal chats and picture exchanges with clients. Physical meetings had to be approved. Our anonymity was our protection. I only met Barb Smith once when I explained the termination. Zenger, the publisher, also canceled their deal with Barb that day. I don't know if her book was ever published. Sometimes you have to be tough. Mo's still learning that. She encourages people, but some relationships have to end. Mo understands her age and appearance can be a challenge, Sharon said. I'm sad to see you step back, Sharon, I said, but I'm ready for the role. Will I have the power to choose which books we take on? Yes, absolutely. I've been sending you manuscripts to give to editors to prepare you. You've questioned a few, and it was the right call every time. Now you'll get paid for it. Oh, and I still own the company, so don't mess it up. She smiled, but it was a serious smile. I've been preparing you, Kyle, she said. You know all but the last 2 editors I hired. You'll meet them at the next company meeting. You know all the companies we work with, and they know you. They approve of you as my replacement. I was a bit surprised. I know I'm young for this role in a growing company. I'm honored by your trust in me. She seemed hesitant. Mo's become your friend, I know. You make a good team, she said. How would you like to work with her more? I nodded. She's really smart. She advised Katudnik to change his novel's climax to a flashback, which helped him finish the book. Sharon agreed. It was smart. That book got nominated for several awards and bigger publishers were interested in Katudnik. I hoped he'd stay with us, but our contract was just for that one book. Zenger hired us to edit Katudnik's work. Mo was a unique person with a lot of talent. We didn't want to ignore her skills. I said, authors like working with her. A few don't take her advice, though. They usually come to me then. Do you think she'd like to handle difficult authors? We have some stubborn ones. She's good at calming them down. They can't believe she has a PhD and authority, or that she's old enough. For someone with limited social experience, she's very good at persuading authors to make changes. I think she might like it, unless it's always tough cases, Sharon said, looking me straight in the eye. She clearly wanted me to handle some of those, too. What kind of family life does she have? I see her at these workshops 3 or 4 times a year, but we usually only talk about our work, I said. I don't really know anything about her. Sharon smiled. Ha! You know her parents and I go way back. Her dad teaches music and coaches singing. Her mom is a professor in psychology. She's very smart, but she has missed out on normal social stuff. No prom, no baseball games. Sharon stopped for a moment. She spent so much time reading, writing, and getting degrees. Only here at our company has she started to grow socially. She's like a flower blossoming. She's good at working with people. She liked talking about Mo. Her teenage years were spent living with my husband and me, going to school with older students. Her parents say she hasn't had a boyfriend, and when they ask, she says she's too busy working. No girlfriend either. She has her own apartment, a cat, and a car. She goes to church and has some responsibilities there. She shrugged. I thought she wanted to say something, but held back. She seemed like she had a secret. I wondered what it could be. Do you mind if I talk to her about all this? I might ask her about her goals. She's too talented to hide away in an office at home, too kind and nice to not have a normal life. Go ahead. I agree we want to keep her. I don't think she wants to leave, at least not yet. I said, I talk to her a lot, but she keeps things about work. I've asked about her family and life, but she just shakes her head or talks about work. Sharon laughed and nodded. That's Mo. It may change, I think. At least a little. She and I talk about things, not just work. We talked about our company until Sharon had to go. 2 hours later, Mo finished with her small group meeting and I met her outside the room. Lunch, Mo? I'd like to talk, I said. Love to, she replied. In all these years of working together, we'd probably only eaten together during group discussions about business. It was never just the two of us as friends. She looked genuinely happy to have lunch with me. We sat and ordered. I told her about the big changes coming at PPU. She wasn't surprised or anxious, just happy to be included. She wasn't jealous as far as I could see. To many people, a PhD beats a master's degree, and that was what mattered. I told her that Sharon had asked me to be managing senior editor. She smiled and congratulated me. She saw my reaction, grateful, happy about the new job. She said, I hope you'll keep me on. I've enjoyed working here. Of course, I said. You're our best editor, Mo, and you handle people very well. I'd like you to take on some of my tasks. Mo held her coffee and looked at me. She wanted to speak. I'd seen that look whenever she had something on her mind. She surprised me with her question. Tell me about Jill, she said. I was taken aback by the change of topic. It was personal. I wondered what she was up to. With Mo, there were no casual questions. Everything had a purpose. I guess that was how she got a PhD at 22. My eyes widened a bit. Tell me about growing up with her, she said. I felt like Mo and Sharon were trying to help me get to know her better. So I talked about Jill and me. I never had to choose a girlfriend or look for one. Jill was the one since I was 7. We grew up playing games, she married a Marine, and we hope to start a family soon. I talked about growing up in Ohio with great memories. Wow. Mo was thoughtful. She sipped her Coke and said, Jill sounds like a great person. I looked into her eyes and she didn't look away. She wanted me to see something there. I looked again. Eventually I asked, Tell me about your life. Do you have a boyfriend? No, not a boyfriend. I looked at her, and suddenly I understood what was in her eyes behind the oval glasses. Her gaze didn't waver. Don't be shy, I said. I knew she was a grown woman, despite seeming young. She had a serious look in those eyes. She didn't look away. Suddenly, I knew what she wanted me to realize. I smiled. Was I slow to catch on? She smiled. "Kyle, you finally understand, don't you?" she said. She looked at me and then away. It was quiet. "I've not had many boyfriends. I turned down a few. If one comes along who is as great as you, I'll let you know. You're hard to match." I didn't take my eyes off her. All those meetings at conferences, talks on the phone, Sharon's hints. I wondered if Mo was turning guys down or discouraging them or just avoiding them for me, so I knew. She was honest and quiet. "I love my wife," I said. Jill was in Okinawa for 4 more months at that point. Mo was small and beautiful with radiant skin. "Of course," Mo said and kept my gaze. "I'm not trying to come between anyone. I want you to love your wife. I don't want a man who doesn't love his wife." She understood me. She respected me. And she wanted my marriage to work. "Why are you telling me now?" I asked. "Because other people can tell how I feel. My mom and I talked about it months ago. I told her about you. She spoke to Dr. Ackerman, who guessed I liked you a long time ago," she said with a smile. "Will it change things?" I asked. I didn't know. "I liked that you kept women at a distance. You discouraged that lady who—" she began, but I held up my hand. One woman at a conference had tried to flirt with me in a bold way. Mo had laughed when the woman walked away after our group activities ended. "I hope you find someone, Mo," I said. "Kyle, do you know why I'm so small?" she asked. I wondered what she was getting at. Was I being manipulated? I said, "I just thought it was genetic." "It is, but it's also a condition, something with my pituitary gland. I stopped growing at 12. They treated it and I grew a bit more. I'm just small and look young, but everything works fine. I can have kids. I'm just small." She always had a reason for saying things. "Why are you telling me this? It doesn't change how I feel about you." "I'm telling you because it's my only secret. Dr. Ackerman knows, my parents know, and anyone who looks at me guesses. You know now. I know you love your wife." We were quiet for a bit. "Would it be awkward around her now?" I said, "Aside from my wife's family, you're my closest friend. I'm glad you told me how you feel. I hope it doesn't change things, but if you need things to change, let me know. If you want to leave, or want me to leave, let me know." She shook her head and smiled, saying, "I'm not unhappy. I love the work. I like seeing you a few times a year, having your attention every day for work. This is the first time we've talked outside of work. My mom said that working together can lead to love. Love is love." I was surprised she used the word love so easily. She must have thought about this for a long time, maybe even talked it over with Sharon. After a moment, she said, "No, I don't like feeling unrequited love. But until I feel this way about someone else, I prefer to be around you now and then." She paused and smiled. "Maybe I'll convince you that the thin red line is an allegory." I laughed. I didn't know how to handle this new role. I told Jill about my conversation with Mo the next time we talked by phone. Jill said, "Some guys flirt with me in the Corps. I don't go out with any one guy. I always go with a group and make it clear I'm married and not interested." "Mo didn't really make a pass," I said. "She just wants things to stay normal. She said she hopes to find someone like me." Jill was quiet. "She still looks so young. I remember thinking she was so tiny." "Yeah, I only see her a few times a year." That was during our long separation because of her work in Okinawa. I edited many books. PPU made money. Mo and I became internet friends. I liked seeing her at 2 more meetings, but we just talked about work. I didn't think things changed with Mo. She mentioned some dates over the years, but never seemed serious about anyone. I wondered if she was still a virgin. But what does that matter anyway? PPU grew. We encouraged writers when we saw potential, and publishers appreciated our efforts. Agents sent writers to us, hoping to sell their books to publishers. Sometimes we told an author their work wasn't good enough, and publishers were relieved. Katudnik won a Pulitzer, partly due to Mo suggesting he reorganize his book. Another author won a Hugo, and several others got reading list nods. We made a lot more money because we were doing well. I took on more of Sharon's duties. I visited publishers to arrange contracts, talked to agents, and sometimes spoke with authors. We hired a lawyer to approve contracts full-time. Mo became the go-to person for other editors. Sending her to help a struggling editor or author didn't scare them. People liked her and wanted her help. When they met her, they were usually surprised by how young she looked. Occasionally, she passed tough cases to me. We always resolved issues. She had high travel expenses, but we produced some great books in the end. Zenger Free Publishing, and we had a special relationship. Sharon knew their president well, and I got familiar with their staff. Sharon once hinted, "We might join with them. Nothing is final yet. It wouldn't be a classic merger. We'll see." Mo was 30, but looked like a teenager. I thought she always would. The Tuesday evening before Jill's deployment leave, Sharon and Zenger's president called me to a meeting. We talked about Zenger and PPU, and they seemed to have plans ready. Sharon said, "We're merging editorial functions. They need you to meet their whole staff. You'll be editor-in-chief. Jerry Mollerwine over there has cancer and won't be staying by his choice." I knew Jerry, a sharp publisher who played Santa Claus at Zenger's Christmas party. I didn't know he was sick. Zenger had offices in Columbus, Ohio, and Raleigh, North Carolina. I'd have to relocate for some months during and after Jill's deployment, but not more than a year. I looked forward to discussing it with Jill during her leave. We'd focus on what was best for us, for her career and for mine. It was time to talk about those kids we had dreamed about. I was married to the only woman I ever wanted to love. I thought we were happy. I was certain things could turn out okay. That Tuesday was a busy day. Jill and I each had a secret. We were excited that evening, but for different reasons. For me, new chances were appearing. For her, things were falling into place. I wanted to share my secret at home with her family, and she wanted to keep hers hidden forever. But neither of us succeeded. A few days after learning Jill had died, I met with the military officers who help families after a death. We sat at the Kinnisons' dining table and talked about insurance, leaving the house at Camp Lejeune, and everything that comes after a military death. They knew Jill and I had been apart when she died, but they didn't ask questions. They had a job to do, and it didn't involve knowing all the Major's personal issues. We planned the funeral. It took hours. The body would soon arrive at Dover Air Force Base in Delaware. After we finished, Captain Sheehan looked at me. "Your wife was very young to be a major," he said. I nodded. "They saw her talent early and promoted her quickly. She was really good at what she did." He nodded. "Probably chosen early for her skills." I had heard that term for people with great potential. Jill didn't like that idea. She thought there were better ways to find and train talented people. The younger officer, a first lieutenant, said, "We're so sorry for your loss, sir." I nodded and said, "I know you are. Thank you." I stood and shook hands with them. They left, and I sat alone at the table thinking. It was awkward. The sudden separation just before her deployment, then her death with so many things unresolved. Her death ended all issues. There would be no divorce. There would be no getting back together. There was no Jill. Our life together now felt like uncertain memories. No matter her guilt or regret, her affair changed everything. I wondered if she just enjoyed being with him more, or if she loved him. Could she love two men at once? Maybe, but she promised to love only me. I couldn't forgive her, not soon, if ever. She broke my heart. I felt angry, but mostly sad. The Marines didn't make a vow like our wedding. I was counting on her promise first and most. Forever, or as long as we lived. My claim on Jill was for life, and ended only now. Ayla and her parents came in, followed by Gil and the girls. We watched the kids quietly, not wanting to talk. I envied Gil and Ayla for their love. I told them about the visit from the Marines and the choices I made. Sometimes one of the girls would come over and sit on her mom or dad's lap and cry. It was that kind of day. I felt welcomed, but not as much a part of the family as before. I guessed Jill had in some way rejected me by choosing another. I missed feeling like I belonged. Gil sat next to me for an hour, talking about his work, the girls, and Ayla. Her body was returned to the country the next morning, reaching Sky Gray a few days later. They advised not to view the body. A sergeant who accompanied the body handed me a box of personal items from Afghanistan and a small bag from Camp Lejeune. Everything was given to me at the funeral home. The sergeant had me sign a list of items. Her personal items included her ID tags, her wallet, keys no one recognized, and other small things. From Lejeune, there were some books, uniform items, her old second lieutenant bars, and the contents of her desk. One item made me pause, and I tried to stay calm. There was a letter with my name on it in a brown envelope. "Only Kyle Franklin," it said in black marker sealed with 2 strips of tape. The tape was unbroken. It was unopened. Also, there was her personal laptop and power cord that she used for work sometimes, and her phone. That phone. I knew no Marine's personal items were sent without being checked. A death meant some officer or sergeant had gone through the stuff to remove anything distressing. Letters were sometimes read. I had no illusions. But these items came from the base where she left her phone. It didn't come from her colonel or colleagues in the Middle East, and no one could access her phone or laptop. I stared at her belongings. I didn't know what to do. The priest from Merciful God Parish visited to talk about the funeral. The Kinnisons and Isla were with me, and we quickly made plans. The priest asked if anyone from the family wanted to say something at the funeral itself. It wasn't necessary, but many families wanted to do it. Knowing the Kinnisons well, he seemed surprised they did not want to say anything, but no explanation was given. He looked at me but didn't ask. I said, "I don't think any of us want to speak, Father." I didn't say more. He looked in my eyes, and I think he saw pain. "As you wish," he said. "I will speak of Jill as I knew her." We all nodded, and he continued. "At the gravesite, I usually let anyone speak who would like to say a few words. Any objection?" I looked at Ayla and the Kinnisons. No objection. "No problem, Father." He sensed a deep silence, and no one explained further. He looked at me and said as I walked him to the door, "You know, confession is a good time to talk in private." "Thank you, Father. I may take you up on that," I said. We shook hands, and he left with a nod to the Kinnisons. I texted Mo. "Funeral the day after tomorrow in sky gray. Thanks for handling things at work." "You're welcome," she responded. "Wish things were different." Since the unit was still in Afghanistan, only a few Marine representatives attended the visitation and funeral. Some sent home for injuries or illness, one specifically for the funeral. Marine reservists were present, along with an honor guard. Sometimes a sudden death meant a funeral without full closure. This funeral was tearful and somber. The priest said many good things about Jill. He talked about her coming to Mass, her athletic skills, her intelligence, and her leadership. He mentioned her service to the country and her death while fighting evil. It was a good sermon, though he didn't know everything. I was grateful for his kind words. He then led us from the church to the nearby graveyard. We buried Jill in the Catholic cemetery in sky gray. It was a nice morning with an honor guard present. I walked with Ayla, Gil, and the children. Mom and Dad Kinnison walked in front of us. Out of respect for me, the whole family stayed close to me, including me in everything. I saw my mom later with her current husband, and Dad with a woman who wasn't a former model. Mom and Dad stood together with their partners, showing their strange relationship, like former lovers who still think of each other first, even though they can't stand each other anymore. We had been a fragmented family longer than we were a whole one. As we walked into the cemetery, I saw Sharon and Mo standing to the side, looking for me. Maybe they missed me at the funeral. "Ayla, I want you to meet some people," I said. "Oh, okay, Gil?" she asked. "Gil?" "Stay with me, girls," Gil said. The girls looked stunned by everything, losing their aunt and the whole sad event. Ayla and I stepped out of line, and Sharon and Mo saw me then. "I didn't expect you here," I said. I held Sharon's hand with my right and Mo's with my left. It was my first time touching Mo, I suddenly thought. "Ayla, this is Sharon Ackerman, my boss. And this is Maureen Murray, another editor. We work together. Ladies, this is my sister-in-law, Ayla, Jill's sister." "Hello," Ayla said. "We're glad to meet you. Kyle talks about you. You're Mo?" she asked. "Maureen or Mo," she said, shaking Ayla's hand. They looked into each other's eyes, and I wondered if Ayla had wondered about Mo for a while. "We hope you'll come to the house after this, both of you," Ayla said. Sharon and Mo nodded. "Of course, we're so sorry," Sharon said, and Mo nodded. I wondered what Ayla was thinking. I saw her give Mo another look. "We should go back," I said. "Please walk with us." They nodded, and we all joined the long line of mourners at the graveside. There would be a ceremony. There were folding chairs for the family under a canopy, so I sat with the Kinnisons. There was a speaker system. A few prayers were said. The priest asked if anyone wanted to speak. A Marine captain who had served with Jill said a few words about her. One of her college friends also spoke. It might have seemed strange that no family member spoke, but that's what happened. There was a pause when no one else volunteered, and then someone moved. I was shocked to see little Mo step up to the microphone. Isla looked at me with a strange expression. The priest lowered the microphone for her. She smiled in thanks, though it was still too high. Sharon behind me leaned over and said, "Don't worry, this will be good." Mo said, "I'm Maureen Murray. I only met Jill twice, but I have worked with her husband for several years now. I know how much he loved her." She paused, looking around at the people, then at me, and went on. Anne Bradstreet wrote a wonderful poem in the 1600s about the love of a wife and husband. It begins, "If ever two were one, then surely we." I think that was Kyle's feeling. She stopped, looked right at me, and said, "This is called Surely We. It's meant to be sung a cappella." I knew the poem well, but not the song. I was curious why she chose it. It talked about the deep love between a wife and husband. She knew my situation. I stared at her as she sang. Was she talking about me and her? No, that would be too much. This song was about Jill and me. And then I understood something about myself. Mo thought love in marriage was noble. She wanted me to be like Anne Bradstreet. She was telling me what she hoped to see in me. She wanted me to love my marriage fully. Jill's betrayal was not my fault. It was beautiful. Mo's voice was surprisingly strong. I stood up as she sang that simple song based on that wonderful idea. I felt Isla's eyes, Dan's, and Penny's on me. Mo saw me standing and smiled as she sang. I remembered something I'd said about Bradstreet. Her virtue is flawless. She loves, and nothing can lessen its nobility. Mo didn't want a man who didn't love his wife. A tear rolled down my cheek. I still loved Jill, and there was no shame in that. Mo's voice was pure and almost holy. By the time she finished the song, everyone wanted it to continue. There was a pause, as if the crowd was in awe. "Thank you for listening," she said softly and went back to stand with Sharon. Sharon smiled at her and patted her on the back. I had no idea she was a singer, and a good one at that. I thought she sounded professional. There was not a hint of nervousness, and her voice was enchanting, much stronger than her speaking voice. Music didn't seem to be a gap. There was a lot I didn't know about my little friend. Every love has a journey to travel. The priest returned to the microphone. "Wonderful," he said, nodding toward Mo. An honor guard fired 3 times, and I flinched. Hundreds came to the funeral, and maybe 100 were at the graveside. Sky Gray turned out for its children, and Jill was one of them. Across the way, I saw Mrs. Devereaux among some military men who gathered together. She looked at me, nodded, and I nodded back. She was a lovely woman. The family sat and watched as they folded the flag from Jill's coffin the way Marines do at serious events. A Marine with many stripes on his arm came to me, holding the flag folded into a triangle. He knelt in front of me and held it out. He said, "On behalf of the President, the Commandant of the Marine Corps, and a grateful nation, please take this flag as a sign of our thanks for your loved one's honorable and faithful service." I took the flag with both hands and said, "Thank you." I didn't say anything about the honorable or faithful part. He stood up, saluted, turned, and left. Everything was slower at the funeral, so it took a while, followed by a few moments of quiet. I took that time to stand and walk to Jill's mom. I bent down on one knee and held out the flag. "You must know, I always saw you as the mother I hoped Jill would be. You were a perfect example. You should have this. She gave her life for her country, and her love for you was never in doubt." I leaned forward, kissed her cheek, and put the flag in her lap. She put her hand on it. I realized I was making a scene. I didn't care. The priest waited for me. I went back to my seat. Dan Kinnison put his arm around me and said, "Kyle, you're the son we didn't have." I said, "It hurts so bad." I looked at his eyes, saw him nod slightly, and knew he was being honest. I left a moment later when everyone was focused on the final prayers. I don't think the Kinnisons noticed. Some people in the crowd might have. I had to go. I had things to do. I made a choice.
The ceremony ended a few minutes later. People just stood unsure what to do next. A woman came up to us and stood in front of Mom. I thought it was probably Mrs. Devereaux. Kyle was not at his seat. Had he left? "I'm Marge Devereaux, Colonel Devereaux's wife," she said. "I was hoping to talk to Kyle. I saw him leave right after he gave you the flag. Is there anything I can do to help you? I am heartbroken." Mom shook her head, not wanting to talk to Mrs. Devereaux. Gil held my hand to calm me. I decided to speak for the family. "No, thank you. There's nothing to be done. We don't know where Kyle went." Did she know about the affair, I wondered? Did she ignore it or not care? We were gathering at my parents' home soon, but only close family and friends were invited. Jill's friends might have found that odd since we were usually welcoming and friendly about everything. Suddenly we were not inclusive. We were polite to Mrs. Devereaux, but did not invite her to our gathering. It was a mostly quiet gathering. Some of our cousins came, along with other family members. Mom and Dad were in and out. Dad later said Mom had some kind of anxiety and just wanted to rest for a few minutes. He stayed with her for about 15 minutes before they came back to the gathering. The most interesting people were Kyle's two colleagues, who were very open, knew some details about the problems, and were worried that Kyle's absence meant more months of sadness. They had to leave soon for their flight, so they missed meeting Mom and Dad. It was Gil who found out that both women had doctorates in literature. Surprisingly, Maureen was almost Jill's age. I heard Gil laughing about it across the room. It was good to hear some laughter on that serious day. He told me about the talk later when I asked. I said, "Miss Murray, your voice was just as pure and lovely as ever, and the song was so moving." She looked at me, smiling, and said, "Thank you. You know, Dr. Gilstrap, I didn't know she knew my title. You and I almost met once before." "Oh?" I asked. "I was at the same ceremony where you were awarded at UNC 8 years ago," she said. "One of your papers had just been published. You were on the stage. I was in the chairs." That's when I started laughing. I said, "No. I hope you don't mind, but how old are you?" And she said, 30. He shook his head, smiling. I said, "You are amazing, Dr. Murray. Kyle didn't tell me you have a PhD, I said. She said, "Kyle sometimes tries not to notice me." Wasn't that a strange way of putting it? It was odd and interesting. I wondered how far their relationship had gone. I think Dr. Maureen Murray is careful with her words when it comes to my dear brother-in-law. Do you think she and Kyle have a relationship? No, I think they kept it all business. Her face was sad. She wasn't hiding anything, and she wanted me to notice. I think she wanted to tell us something, like you said about her words. I'm pretty sure of one thing. Gil was smiling. "What?" I asked. I thought I knew too. Maureen loves him, and she wanted us to know. Gil smiled and waited. I liked her. I thought about that. We invited Sharon and Maureen to dinner with us. Maureen seemed to want to stay, but they said they had to get to the airport. I got their email addresses. Mo is the one to contact, Dr. Ackerman said. She and Kyle work together on everything. He contacts her often, more than daily. She looked at me like there was more to say, but she stayed quiet. Kyle called that evening. "Hello, A." "Gil," I yelled. "Kyle's on the phone." Gil came into the room. "Putting you on speaker, Gil's with me," I said. "The girls are out for the evening." I heard Kyle take a deep breath through his nose. Kyle had always made a lot of noise when he breathed. His nose had been hit many times during baseball and football games. He could still breathe, but one ear, nose, and throat doctor once joked, "How many times have you broken this nose?" Kyle just laughed it off. He never went to the doctor for a missed baseball. He cried and complained as a kid but kept playing. "Hey, Gil." "Kyle, we're here for you. You're one of us," Gil replied. "Thanks," Kyle said. "That was quite a funeral, huh?" "Yeah," Ayla nodded, looking at Gil. "We met your two friends from work, Dr. Ackerman and Dr. Murray." "I didn't know she could sing," Kyle said with a hint of a smile. "It was some performance," Gil agreed, nodding. "It seemed like she was singing to you." Ayla added, "I felt the same. I just couldn't face everyone," Kyle admitted. There was a pause before Kyle continued. Reason I called. Jill left me a letter, her phone, and her laptop. I charged her phone." He stopped speaking. My heart sank. I wondered if Jill had planned for her death. Had she written everything down, explained every detail? I thought of all the troubling messages she might have saved or deleted. Maybe she wanted Kyle to know everything. Or perhaps she tried to protect his feelings. Would knowing all the details help Kyle? Would it hurt him? Was it better if he never knew the worst? Or did he need complete honesty to move on? What would help a man move past his wife's infidelity? "Oh," I said. Gil glanced at me. "Kyle, I think you should read the letter and check the phone," Gil suggested. Let me talk to Ayla first, okay, buddy? Kyle took a deep breath, like he was looking for guidance. I muted the phone. Should he know every detail? What if she wrote something really hurtful? I asked, shaking my head. How does that help Kyle now? I couldn't picture Jill saying such things to anyone but Kyle. How does a good wife end up in such a situation? Humiliation can destroy a man. It would destroy me, Gil said, meeting my eyes. I loved him for his honesty. He continued, some men might need to know everything. They need the truth to heal. Kyle is probably one of them. He might think everyone knew about the affair and he was the fool for not seeing it. Men are different, I guessed. Then I remembered Mrs. Devereaux approaching us, and I wondered what she knew. I don't think anyone would want to go to those depths. Gil shook his head. He needs to know, Ayla. He's your best friend and you're his. You both lost someone important. I put my hand on Gil's cheek for a moment. He turned his head and kissed my palm. He knew me and understood how I felt about Kyle. He loved me for who I was. I unmuted the phone. Kyle, whatever you decide, call me after, okay? I said. Okay? Would you rather? He started. No, Kyle, it's up to you. Share what you want, but you should decide what I know, I said. Gil nodded. Kyle was quiet and thoughtful. Okay, I'll call back, maybe tonight, he said. Goodbye, both of you. Bye, Kyle, we both said. I clicked off the call. We didn't speak for a moment. Gil hugged me from behind and kissed my neck. You know how Kyle's going to get past this? Gil asked. No, I replied. Is it possible? He smiled. Two things. First, he's going to get really mad. Any good husband would. Maybe knowing more will bring that out. Okay, I get it. The second thing? I asked. He smiled. He needs a nice girl to love him. For a second, I thought he meant me. He shook his head. No, not you. You and Kyle love each other, but you have me, and Kyle wouldn't break that. I doubt you would either, he said with humor. No, I mean Maureen. I felt a bit jealous, then realized she was part of the solution. Gil saw it too. She might look young, but she was a woman who loved Kyle. There was something different in how he treated her. He spoke of his friend Mo for years, and I thought Mo was a man. I doubted she competed for his love because of the song she chose at the funeral. She seemed like she really wished Jill were still alive for Kyle. Kyle probably kept his distance from her, avoiding anything that might lead to an affair. Gil rested his cheek on my shoulder. I think Maureen loves him, or wants to. I thought Kyle knew how she felt, and returned it as much as a married man could. Jill's affair might have surprised him, but he managed to stay faithful to his wife, even as he found his next potential love. Maureen loved Kyle, and that wasn't a bad thing. She wanted us to know it.
Dwight called around 3 a.m. after the Kinnison funeral. I was still in Ohio and hadn't had a chance to talk to Kyle Franklin. I noticed that the family didn't invite me to their gathering. I was sure now that they were avoiding me. I wasn't sure if they blamed Ike or the Marines for Jill's death. But Kyle had stopped talking to us before she died, and all my emails to Kyle went unanswered. Major Kinnison's sister also said they weren't angry at the Marines. I just couldn't understand it. Dwight's calls came late at night because of the time difference. We'd talk about how things were going, his job, and in the past we talked about more personal things. Dwight was a regimental commander now. This weighed on him, and he needed comfort, not excitement. I went to Major Kinnison's funeral, I said, after we talked about missing each other and life over there. I missed the visitation. I was at another funeral for Lance Corporal Thomas, who was killed with her. How did it go? Dwight asked from overseas. Weird. We had a hard time finding her husband, Kyle Franklin. He went home to Ohio instead of staying on base. I made it to the funeral. When they gave him the flag, he handed it to her mother. I never got to speak with him, I explained. Dwight exhaled loudly. He did that sometimes under stress, even while driving. She and I hardly talked after we got to Afghanistan, he said. Why? I asked. We were too busy. She was good at her job. There weren't supply problems. She knew her stuff, he said. She thought the whole logistics team was great. S4 liked working with her. It made things easier for him. Oh, I said. Dwight usually didn't talk much about issues and people. It seemed like he wanted to clear something up about Major Kinnison. Did you know anything about her home life? I asked. He was blunt. Yeah. Camp Pendleton contacted us when she was there for a medical procedure. Maybe they were having trouble having a baby or something. I knew what the procedure was. I was a registered nurse until my husband's job needed my time. We talked about other things after that. It didn't seem strange until after we hung up. Dwight knew gossip. He usually knew basic things about his Marines, like if they were married or had kids. I was surprised he knew so much about Major Kinnison's situation. How long ago was that? He didn't say. He'd usually forget things that didn't affect him or the Marines long term.
I picked up the envelope. Only Kyle was written on it in big black letters. At the bottom, in Jill's small handwriting, it said, "Read this first, Kyle, please." I read it out loud, alone in the room. Major Jill Kinnison, Franklin. "Dear Kyle, I lost the love of my life. You. I am so sorry. You'll never know how much. When you left so suddenly that night, I realized I had lost the best part of me. I can't believe what I did, what I agreed to do, the lies I told every day. I was less than I had been. I don't know why, I just did it. It felt like I was living two lives at once. I ended all contact with Colonel Devereaux. I cut it off without explaining. I even wrote down and remembered what to say. I told him, "Colonel, our private relationship must end now. What we did was wrong, and I need to get past my guilt. I'll tell no one, and I expect the same from you." He looked relieved. I was just another problem solved before deployment. "We'll speak no more of it, Major, at least until we return to the States," he said. He didn't object. If he tried to talk about it again, I planned to tell his wife and you, but that's not needed since you are reading this. I turned and walked away. I will not be alone with him ever again. No one knows about our affair. Not the other Marines, not his wife, absolutely no one. Only you, Ayla, Gil, and, oh my God, Mom and Dad. I saw Mom's eyes when Ayla told her. I think of those eyes every day now. I left my phone and computer for you. I was going to destroy them or delete all messages and recordings, but I have done enough wrong to you. It is up to you what you want to know about my affair with Colonel Devereaux. By looking at everything in the phone in order, you'll be able to piece it together with as much detail as you want. I wish you wouldn't look at the recordings on the computer, but it is your choice. I hope whatever you decide, to see everything, just some things, or nothing, will ease your mind eventually. I wish you would destroy everything unread, unheard, unseen. It was an affair. I said things, did things. It was selfish and didn't consider you and me. Us. I love you, not him. I am so sorry. At least if you are reading this, I will never have to face you again. I changed the password on all apps and devices. It's now the same on the phone and laptop. Lowercase, no spaces. Non semper fi. 1. I ruined my life. I hurt the person who loved me most, and it can't be fixed. Maybe it can get better for you, though. I am lost. I loved you. I died inside. I failed my family, myself, and you. I even failed the Marines. Love someone. If you can, forgive me. Jilly sat back down. We weren't kids anymore. I stared at her phone. What did I really want to know? What could I live without knowing? Could I find peace without knowing? Would the questions keep coming back? Why couldn't I just be a man mourning his wife? I felt the need to understand when her affair started, if our child was really ours, and why Jill put our marriage at risk. How could she start something like this? What pushed her to cheat with her boss? When did she stop respecting our marriage? I was always careful not to get too close to anyone else. I thought of Mo. Mo was as careful as I was because she thought she loved me. At Jill's funeral, Mo sang about the beauty of marriage. I turned on Jill's phone and computer trying to find answers. Her password worked on the first try. I saw where I made a mistake when I found Devereaux's message, but I made sure not to delete anything else. She had recordings and videos on her computer in a folder called Only Kyle. I looked through her phone and computer messages. I searched for Devereaux on her phone and found many items. I skimmed through business messages and some personal ones, too. I found texts, voice messages, chats, and videos sorted by date. A week after Jill started her new job, I found work messages from Devereaux. They were all about work until the end of the second week. Jill replied to a message congratulating her on a major selection 2 days later. "This can't happen again. It's too risky." Devereaux replied quickly. "It was amazing. Unexpected, but you're right, never again here." Jill, I wasn't protected. I took a drink. It burned. 5 weeks later, their messages had more hints. It was Christmas Day. We were at Camp Lejeune, Jill. I see now. Believing in principle is different from having so many responsibilities. I must deal with the problem, but it isn't me. I don't believe in what I'm doing. Devereaux, I can help. Temporary duty to Pendleton in a week or so. A week or so later, another message and reply. Devereaux, It would be better if you went off base. Jill, I'll use a civilian facility. Jill again. I have an appointment in LA at 7 a.m. Monday. Procedure on Tuesday. A few days later, the day before she left for Camp Pendleton, he messaged her, Devereaux. I'll arrive at LAX American Airlines Saturday morning around 11 a.m. Jill, what about Marge? Devereaux, I told her I was going to a meeting at HQ Marine Corps. I'll drive to RDU and fly to LA. Jill, I'll pick you up. You'll stay till I leave? Devereaux, of course. Then there was silence for some time. I realized they didn't need to text then. They were together. They had decisions to make, responsibilities to juggle, and ways to justify their actions. Discussions about doing the right thing didn't matter anymore. Her duty and honor did not include me. A pregnancy would have stopped her deployment. It would have complicated things. It might have meant a lifetime of lying to her husband. Her trip to California fooled me. They relied on my trust. The abortion changed everything for them. After their unprotected sex, they didn't talk about it much at first. But after the abortion, their caution vanished. They started having sex about a month later after a deep talk in Jill's office. Jill once wrote, I can't deny I want you, but we can't be careless. They began having sex regularly but secretly. They avoided work, although the colonel liked to touch her when no one was around. She always feared someone would notice her clothes. After nearly getting caught, they stopped what they had been doing in her office. She didn't like stopping. As far as I could tell, they met mostly on Saturday afternoons or Tuesday evenings when he had meetings. He held those meetings early, freeing up his evening. He had a room on base for nights he didn't want to drive home. It was a good cover. They used it twice a week, sometimes more. They thought no one knew. When Colonel Devereaux was away, they had calls he recorded and sent to her computer. I could hear their voices, but I won't replay those words here. Their actions continued until I discovered everything. Secrets don't stay hidden forever. You know how much I like tasting you, Devereaux? Devereaux. Yes, it's wet. Jill. Thinking of you makes me wet. I feel my fingers moving in and out, wishing you were here. Devereaux. Moan. I don't think I've ever been this turned on. Jill. I wish you were here. I wish we could be together. Their texts went on like this, sounding strange to me until he shouted, I'm coming! And she moaned in response. Their texts got more and more daring. They never mentioned me. They often talked about the colonel's large size. Devereaux. You seemed to enjoy me more yesterday. Jill. It's like a fire hose. I loved it before it got hard. I loved having it rest on my shoulder as I sat in that chair. Devereaux. It fits you now. No more pain. Jill. You were bigger this time. I felt it deep inside me. LTBFBYI didn't know what the letters meant, so I looked back through the messages and realized it meant love to be with you. They had other versions too. Can't wait to be with you and want to be with you right now. They made their own little language. It was like something teenagers would do, probably very exciting for them. He asked her to call him Colonel once, and it became a thing for them sometimes. I didn't know what it really meant. There was a video. I played the first one. It seemed to be recorded on a computer. The light wasn't great, but you could tell it was Jill and Devereaux, and their voices were clear. You're a good girl, he said. I want to be yours, Colonel, she replied. A few minutes later, Devereaux got up and turned off the camera. There was another video that showed them in bed as Jill talked, and then they discussed work. It was about a week before her leave. I doubt we'll meet up in the Middle East, Devereaux said. Too much going on, not enough privacy. We should keep it for here. But I love being close to you, Jill said. No private times at all? Devereaux smiled. Sounds great, but no, I don't think so. Too much risk. So far, no one knows. I don't even think my wife suspects, and she caught me once 2 years ago. There was quiet for a bit. Are you still with her? Jill asked. He laughed. Not on Tuesday nights or Saturday. You keep me busy, he said. Are you with your husband? He asked. Yes. Not on the days I'm with you. He asked, have you thought about, you know? She lifted her head and kissed him gently. Tuesday. It was quiet for another bit. Jill was tracing patterns on his chest with her finger. Does your husband know? Suspect? He asked her. Kyle? No, not at all. Even with the procedure, he didn't suspect. He trusts me. I could see Devereaux nodding. Jill went on. We covered it well, I think. I'm glad you had it done, he said. I wish, Jill said, but then stopped. A few minutes later, Jill was quietly crying with Devereaux's arm around her. After some time, he got up and turned off the camera. There are all kinds of bravery, just like there are all kinds of loyalty. Maybe the culture around her made her weak. We talked about the harsh language people used. She said it was all around her, even though she tried not to use it herself. Maybe she changed her principles to fit in. Maybe it just happened. Ah, Jill, by the end, I didn't know you. Devereaux and Jill met the Tuesday evening before she came home on leave. It was a big deal for their relationship. It's only yours, she said, always. In a message, she said, I had no idea it could mean so much to me to share this with only you. He said, You're mine, Major. Marge is just not the same. Being with Kyle will never be the same, she said. It wasn't just the physical part. I couldn't stop thinking about that message. The last few texts were about missing each other. The last one she sent was on the plane, coming home for her leave. I only knew about the one photo on her phone, the one I found after our flight. Maybe she deleted the others. For the first time, I wished Jill was more like Isla. I sat quietly, thinking about what I had read and seen, piecing together their affair. I called Ayla. She picked up, and I told her about the abortion, Jill's affair with Devereaux, and that no one else knew. I didn't think Mrs. Devereaux knew, she said. I don't think so either. Devereaux mentioned it a few weeks before he left. There wasn't anything else to say. It was late, so we ended the call. I sent a message to Mo, who called me back quickly. We talked about Ann Bradstreet, marriage, and disappointment. I was angry at a dead woman and her living lover. Ayla, a few months later, telling the story, Kyle? Kyle? Are you awake? I asked. I could hear his breathing on the phone. Yeah, I'm sober. Is there something I need to do? He replied. We don't have much to connect us now. She's gone, you have Gil and the girls, and I have Wild Turkey. Not much of a link. I laughed a bit. Good. Are you okay? Mom and Dad always worry and ask about you. You're not the usual son-in-law. He sighed. Yeah, they're great. Why did you call? Did you get an invite? Jill's regiment is coming home next Friday. They want families, especially of the deceased, to feel welcome. It was in the mail. Kyle was quiet. At Lejeune? I've got some emails, but I don't really read them. Yes, there'll be a ceremony, and then the Marines will join their families. I guess there will be a speech from the colonel, maybe short. I paused. Devereaux. Kyle didn't say anything. Kyle? I asked after a minute. I'll be there, he said firmly. I was surprised he decided so fast. Jill's cheating and her death were still painful. Maybe he was ready to move forward.
Mrs. Devereaux called me a week before they returned. We will be there, I said. Mom, Dad, me, my husband, and our girls. But Kyle, you know they had problems. She replied, Yes, I've heard. I don't get it. Did he not want her to deploy? That can be hard for couples. No, it was personal. Honestly, Kyle is family, but they had a falling out before she left and they never fixed it. Kyle is probably my best friend. I'll talk to him, but we won't know until the day. He told me he'd go. Okay? Mrs. Devereaux was silent, then agreed. Yes, I understand. I'm sorry she left things like this when she went overseas. It's left a bad feeling, I said. I called Kyle 4 days before the return. Kyle? Ayla. Ayla, I have Mo here. Can she join? He asked. I was surprised but said, Yes, sure. Okay, Mo and Ayla here, Kyle said. Hi, Ayla, Mo said in her soft voice. She could sing strongly, but in person she seemed shy. I didn't quite understand her. Mo, nice to hear you. Are you going with Kyle to the homecoming? I asked, and Gil smiled, amused at my question. Should I? Kyle? Mo asked. Kyle sounded puzzled. I didn't think about it. Why not? I'm flying into RDU. Can you pick me up, Mo? What do you think, eh? Of course, Mo said. I'm honored.
I'm Dr. Maureen Murray. I was waiting at RDU when Kyle came. He smiled, and we hugged longer than usual. He didn't lift me, but I think he wanted to. I held his shoulders. We talked more often now, even though he lived in Columbus and worked for Zenger, so we weren't dating. If he was ready someday, I'd be open to it. So good to see you, Mo, he said. He looked into my eyes more than before. It made me feel a bit shy and happy. Good to see you, I said. He held my hand as we walked to get his bags. He was more open and happier than at the funeral. He didn't have that dark, sad look anymore. Maybe he was getting better. We had plenty of time to talk as I drove us to Jacksonville. He was worried about the homecoming. This is something I didn't expect. I'll be the only husband of a deceased Marine and she was a higher-up. How should I behave? I said, act as a good man would. You have no reason to feel uncomfortable. He didn't mention Jill's affair. Kyle, your respect for your marriage shouldn't be less because someone else didn't respect it, even her. How could I make him see his wife's affair didn't make him less? You always quote that Bradstreet poem, he said. I laughed. We were near Kinston, heading to Jacksonville. Bradstreet was a role model for a loving partner, I said. I'm ready to move past all this. I want to remember Jill as she was, not how she acted in the last months. I nodded. Maybe you will after the homecoming. Kyle stared out at the trees and swamp, lost in thought. We met the Kinnisons at the motel as we took bags from the trunk. I had met Gil and Ayla, but somehow I missed Dan and Penny Kinnison at the funeral and gathering. I also didn't see the children. Mo, this is Dan and Penny Kinnison, Jill and Ayla's parents, Kyle said. I moved forward and Mrs. Kinnison reached out her hand. Your song was so lovely at the graveside, Penny said, shaking my hand. She looked at me awkwardly for a moment, then hugged me. Thank you, I was nervous. I sing at a lot of weddings, but not many funerals, I said. I wanted it to be special for Kyle. You work with Kyle? Dan asked while shaking my hand. I do, but I only see him a few times a year at meetings, I said. We email a lot. Kyle stayed by my side, so I never felt alone or awkward with the Kinnisons. He watched over me like I was a kid. Sometimes that helped me, but other times I wanted to be my age. We spent the late afternoon at the motel's indoor pool, watching the kids splash. They didn't quite know what to think of me. Sometimes they treated me like another child, so I joined in their splashing, and other times they remembered I was an adult. I wore a one-piece swimsuit that actually made me look decent. Kyle enjoyed tossing the girls in the water again and again, and I loved my 2 throws as well. I asked him, "You're really good at this. Have you practiced tossing little people, maybe in a bar?" He looked at me, not getting it at first, then burst out laughing. I'd never seen him laugh so hard. He didn't know what to say. Isla was stunning. She was tall and slim, wearing a simple one-piece suit. Kyle didn't toss her. She was different from her short, round husband, yet they seemed very happy together. It was nice to see. He was the smart mathematician who loved his family, and she was the beautiful wife who saw the best in him and his work. When I first met Jill, I thought she was the pretty one in the family. She was pretty, but Ayla stood out more. We had a late dinner at a local shrimp place and talked for an hour until the little girls got sleepy from all the swimming and driving. Then we returned to the motel, and Kyle walked me to my door. He hesitated for a moment. Mo, we're not starting from zero, you know. But it's only been 4 months since she died. 7 since I found out about, but 4 since she passed. I touched my finger to his lips. Shh, I understand. We have time. Her family is your family. They're wonderful. The girls are lovely. Ayla, Gil, her parents. You have so much love around you. I see why you had such a happy youth. I felt my heart break for all the emotions he must be feeling. Then I went inside. The next morning, Penny and Dan rode with Kyle and me to the homecoming. The Gil Straps came in their minivan. We had special passes to enter the gate, and there were signs guiding us to the regimental area. It was my first time on a military base. I was shocked at how big it was and that I saw no guns except at the front gate. We passed some tanks and vehicles driving in the sandy soil, and Kyle explained what we were seeing. The regiment returned to Camp Lejeune 1 battalion at a time, probably as they got off the ship in Morehead City. Jill's unit, the regiment's headquarters company, arrived on a Friday morning around 11 o'clock, with the infantry battalions returning throughout the afternoon. The crowd stood around the field, held back by tape barriers that could be easily moved. There was a podium and a speaker system facing the crowd, and an open area for a battalion to stand before release. A Marine band played off to the side. Trucks left the company at the armory a quarter-mile down the street so they could drop off their weapons. The crowd was impatient. They watched the company hand in their weapons, then march toward the field, which felt like forever for the crowd that had already waited 7 months. As it turned out, it was good they returned their weapons first. Mrs. Devereaux gathered the families of the company's fallen and wounded by the corner of the tape barrier. "Hello, I'm Marge Devereaux, Colonel Devereaux's wife. I'm glad you could come," she said to us. There were 10 or so who had been wounded. "I need to get everyone's name so Ike knows who he's talking to." Usually the company marches onto the field, the colonel talks briefly, then he'll come to each wounded person, and then each family of a fallen Marine, from our left to right. If he gets mixed up, just correct him and point out who's who, she said. He'll talk to me about it later. She smiled. So she had us stand at that corner of the ground, in front, with the wounded to our left and the other family members to our right. I stood behind Kyle, to his right, so I could see between Dan and him. It was a low-key position, but I thought it was right. It would be awkward introducing a coworker to the colonel. Mrs. Devereaux was kind and warm. I did not know how much an officer's wife did for military families, contacting, helping, organizing, counseling. She walked down the line, getting names and speaking with everyone. She remembered every family name, I could tell. She made a point of speaking to Kyle. "I'm glad you decided to come, Kyle," she said, holding out her hand. "Thank you, ma'am," he said, shaking her hand. Kyle looked deeply into her eyes. "I'm so sorry for your loss," she said. Kyle nodded. "Thank you." Mrs. Devereaux stood there for another moment, waiting, but Kyle said nothing. He just kept looking into her eyes. He probably wanted to check if she knew, but he couldn't really figure it out. "All right, they should be here any minute," she said. "I'm really glad you're here." She left just as the first group marched onto the field. I doubted she knew her husband had been with Jill. Kyle was on our left with Mr. and Mrs. Kinnison next to him. Then Gil and the girls were beside Ayla. Colonel Devereaux spoke briefly to the crowd. The sons stood at ease in front of their families. There was a lot of anxiety and desire to see them, to hug them again. Colonel Devereaux felt it too, but he had to acknowledge that some had been hurt, some would be disabled for life, and some didn't make it home. He talked about sacrifice and honor. 4 months ago on a terrible afternoon, this company lost 2 soldiers who were killed and 6 were injured. 4 more were hurt over the other months. We are thankful we didn't lose more from this company. I want to greet you who have lost so much, he said. He left the podium and moved to where Mrs. Devereaux stood with us, shaking hands with parents and loved ones of the wounded and those who had passed. She gave a list to an older Marine with him. Colonel Devereaux was a very tall, fit, and sunburnt man. He was much taller than most Marines. He was with a stocky, middle-aged sergeant major who didn't look very friendly. The colonel did all the talking, addressing each family using the list Mrs. Devereaux had made. He moved along the line, speaking to families, shaking hands, and sometimes hugging a mother, father, or wife. I heard things like, "So glad Sergeant Wilson is back on his feet," and "The Corps stands by its wounded." Most words were private and probably meant to comfort. It was serious and sad as some wives, mothers, and fathers cried. In many cases, a wounded Marine stood next to them. One family held a large picture of a son who had died. He came to Kyle, the first of Jill's family. I saw him clearly. Devereaux was quite a bit taller. The adjutant had the list and told him who the family was. Devereaux nodded. "Major Kinnison's family?" the colonel asked. He looked at the whole group, meeting everyone's eyes. "I am so sorry for your loss. She was a great Marine, a wonderful person in every way. Major Kinnison will always be a part of this regiment, this division, this Marine Corps. We will never forget her, nor her sacrifice." He looked directly at Kyle. "You are Major Kinnison's husband? Kyle, right?" "Yes, I am." I looked at the big man, knowing the pain he had caused the Kinnison family and the harm he had done to Kyle. I saw arrogance in him. I think Kyle saw it too. I remembered a quote from Tolstoy, "Our life has been joined not by man but by God. That union can only be broken by a crime, and a crime of that nature brings its own punishment." I doubted the colonel was thinking about Tolstoy, though. She was like my right arm. She ran her team beautifully. Her Marines loved her. "Her loss is terrible," Devereaux said. He said very seriously, "Always faithful." He reached out his hand to shake Kyle's. Kyle looked at the hand and then back at the colonel. He acted so quickly that Ayla later asked if he'd planned it. He looked up into the colonel's eyes and said very seriously, "Always faithful, my foot." I don't think the colonel saw it coming, so when Kyle punched him in the jaw, it knocked him to the ground. He didn't wake up for 5 minutes. It broke his jaw, which had to be wired shut later that afternoon at the hospital. The punch carried Kyle across the barrier and almost on top of the colonel. He stayed on his feet for another second. There was a moment of shocked silence. Then there was noise and movement everywhere. The sergeant major tackled Kyle at my feet. Several Marines jumped in, piling on top of Kyle and the sergeant major. People were yelling. I was so small that I got caught in the crowd, which pushed forward like a wave. I tried to move to the right to escape, but people were too big and blocked my way. My feet weren't even on the ground. I saw through gaps between people. Gil had his daughters close, keeping them safe. Dan moved towards Gil and the girls with his arm around Penny. I started to panic as the crowd pulled me away from them. Suddenly, I felt a hand grab my arm, pulling me to the right through the crowd. Ayla was pulling me into her family's circle. My feet touched the ground again. She held me, saw I was okay, and smiled. Her left arm was around me, her right around her mom, with the girls safe in the middle. My left arm was around Gil, and my right around Ayla. It happened in seconds, but I was never so scared as when the crowd moved and my feet weren't touching the ground. I don't know if she heard me in the noise, but I said thanks. The crowd's push stopped, and people in front moved to avoid the pile of Marines on top of Kyle. Mrs. Devereaux, standing to our right, froze for a moment and then lifted the yellow tape to go to her husband. She was worried, of course. It took her a few extra seconds to get there because of the pile-up. "This is a wonderful day," Isla said to me, and I felt it too. The sun was shining, the soldiers were home, and it was warm. There was no shame in defending love. I wondered if I'd soon be dating someone in jail. I looked forward to telling my parents that. I said to Ayla, "Probably not the way Anne Bradstreet would have done it." Ayla looked at me and laughed. "It's good to be understood." There was chaos. I heard Marines saying things like, "Major Kinnison's husband punched out the colonel and knocked him out with one punch." A band member said, "Greatest homecoming ever." Everyone wanted to know what happened and why. Marines, still standing in their lines, were looking back and forth and talking. I laughed softly, but with tears. Our group hug ended with the danger, but we stayed close together. Ayla moved next to Gil, who said, "Kyle, you gotta love Kyle." Ayla leaned her cheek against her husband's head. Mrs. Devereaux made her way around the Marines to her husband. She knelt beside him, her hand on his hair. A Navy medic got to him from the other side and also knelt. He checked his vital signs and felt Devereaux's jaw gently. He seemed to reassure Mrs. Devereaux. Military police arrived, yelling at the crowd to back up. Sergeants and lieutenants were calling their men back to ranks. Several platoons stood at attention, organized by their leaders. Mrs. Devereaux stroked her husband's prickly hair. His hat was nowhere to be seen. MPs pulled 6 Marines off Kyle now that the game of buck-buck was over. Those Marines headed back to their ranks. Gil was nodding and smiling. Dan and Penny weren't sure what to do, but Ayla had her arm around her mom, who looked smug. Was she glad Kyle hit Devereaux? I didn't know. "Dad," Ayla said, "Mom, take our car if you want to take the girls to the motel. Spend the day at the pool. Or go shopping. Gil, Mo, and I will stay with Kyle." She looked at me and I nodded. No telling how long he'll be in jail. Might be overnight. Whatever it is, we'll find out. We might need to get him a lawyer. Ayla was happy. Dan had Penny by the arm and was all smiles. "Make sure he's all right. It's good to see Kyle acting like himself again," he said as Gil handed him the keys to their minivan. "Mom," Penny said, almost as if she were over her own worries, "we'll take care of the girls. Don't worry. Find out what they're going to do about Kyle. We'll love taking care of the girls. They'd find things to do. My parents were going to like them, I was sure. This family needed Kyle. He was a good man." The girls were confused by everything. Ayla said, "Girls, we'll talk about Uncle Kyle's bad words later." She was smiling. The girls must have wondered why Mom was smiling if Uncle Kyle did something bad. Ayla went on, "We'll talk about it later. Go with your grandparents, okay? We're going to stay with Uncle Kyle today." She kissed them, and Grandma and Grandpa led them by hand to the van in the parking lot. Ayla looked at me and said firmly, "We're going to talk about it. We'll talk about commitment and honor and always being true. They will know when always is." I smiled at her. "You don't choose when to be good. You try to be good all the time." The whole company was called to attention, every platoon back in order, every group sharp and controlled again. Kyle looked a little dazed as 2 men lifted him by the arms and carried him off. The regimental executive officer was in charge now. He couldn't speak long because of the siren. A siren got louder, and soon an ambulance pulled onto the grass nearby. Devereaux was groaning and waking up. Marge looked thoughtful as she knelt beside him. I think it dawned on her why Kyle did what he did. Maybe she had other hints of the affair, other signs. She looked at Kyle between 2 military policemen and then at Ayla. She tilted her head as if to ask a question, and I saw Ayla nod back. Marge understood. She was nodding as she ruffled her husband's hair and looked at him, her face sad. She looked directly at Ayla, who was 25 feet away, shaking her head slightly, and said clearly, completely out of context, "I didn't know.
Kyle was taken to the provost marshal for processing. It wasn't far, so Mo, Gil, and I walked there. We saw them take Kyle around back, but then he disappeared inside. We went in the front, and Mo walked up to a high desk she could barely see over. "Might be best if I do the talking, Mo," I said, catching up. She smiled. "Yeah, probably." "Hi, I'm Ayla Gilstrap. They just brought my brother-in-law in for processing. We'd like to talk to someone about how things work, how we can get him a lawyer, things like that." The slim guy at the desk seemed happy to help. "Processing can take some time, ma'am, but if you'll wait, I'll get someone to come out and help you once we know what's going on." "What's his name?" "Kyle Franklin. He's a civilian," I said. "We'll wait over here." My phone buzzed as I sat down. Emily Sims. "Hello, Em," I said. "Ayla," the usually cheerful Emily said. "Kyle is famous. The video is trending. Already 15,000 views," she laughed. "I guess people just love to see a colonel get taken down by a short guy." "We figured somebody would post it," I said with some regret in my voice. "I don't need to know what happened, but I may be able to help. I know a good JAG lawyer, and he might be at Camp Lejeune right now. Would you like me to give him your number? I couldn't think of a better way to find a lawyer. This is the person who helped Jonas?" I remembered that his lawyer had written a book about his case, which had received a lot of attention. "Yeah, Tom Marx. He's very good. If anyone can help you, he can, although it looks pretty clear to me." "I think so too," I said. "Yes, ask him to call me. We're at the provost marshal's office right now while Kyle is being processed." "Okay, expect his call. He's usually very quick. Bye." She hung up. I looked at Gil and Mo to my right. "That was Emily Sims, an old friend of ours," I said, directing my words to Mo. "She knows a lawyer here and says he's pretty good. She gave him my number." Mo said, "I wouldn't know where to look. I guess having a friend recommend someone is the best we can do." We found seats along the wall. We sat there quietly. A few minutes later, a tall, gray-haired Marine general came out from the back. We were the only ones waiting, so he came right to us. He looked at Mo's and then at my left hand before speaking to me. "Mrs. Gilstrap?" I stood up, and so did Mo and Gil. "Yes?" "I just got off the phone with Emily Sims. I'm Tom Marx," he said. His eyes were sharp and focused, but the lines around them showed he liked to smile. He had a star on each collar. "What a coincidence that you were here," I said. "Yes, I'm Ayla Gilstrap. This is my husband Gil, and our friend Maureen Murray. Mo's a co-worker and close friend of Kyle's." He shook hands with Gil, then with Mo, looking at Gil a bit longer than usual, and staring at Mo with intent. He nodded and smiled. "I hope we can use a conference room, so if you'd all come back." We followed the tall and energetic General Marx into the back. He spoke to a major and some men in plain clothes, shook their hands, and pointed us to a room. We were soon seated around a table. Marx came in a few minutes later with a briefcase. "Good. Sorry for the wait. I had to change some plans." He then explained the usual procedures. Kyle would probably stay in the brig overnight, might stay on base for a trial, or it could be moved to a civilian court. He didn't know yet who would handle the case, or if it would even go to trial. He opened his briefcase and laptop. He played recordings of Kyle. One video had 24,000 views. He played 2 for us, and we just watched. At one point he paused the video and looked closely as the colonel said, "Semper Fidelis," though we couldn't hear it. It looked bad to me. Marx noticed my worry. "Video isn't always as clear as it seems," he said. "It can show motivation sometimes, but often it confuses things." He looked thoughtful. "I'd like to talk to Kyle. If you want, I'll offer to defend Mr. Franklin. It's up to him, of course." Gil, Mo, and I looked at each other. I saw agreement in their eyes. "Yes, we'd like you to take the case," I said. "At least let Kyle decide." He smiled. "Excuse me, I'll tell them not to question Kyle without me there." He left the room for about 5 minutes. He took a seat. "They won't question him. Now why'd he hit the colonel?" We talked for 45 minutes. The general asked one question after another about relationships, the affair, even about Mo and Gil. He wasn't surprised to find out Gil was Dr. Gilstrap, but he seemed amazed that Mo was Dr. Murray. He quickly hid his surprise. Finally, he pushed his chair back and looked relaxed. "Mrs. Gilstrap, Dr. Murray, Dr. Gilstrap, it's been a pleasure. I wish it were under different circumstances. I'll go talk to Kyle now. That could take a while, and you probably won't see him tonight. I suggest you go shopping or swimming to distract yourselves. I'll be in touch by tomorrow afternoon at the latest, probably before. Any questions? He looked around at us, but we all shook our heads. We were happy to leave things in his hands. He seemed to understand the situation. He stood up, so we did too. Well then, I'll go see our guy. He shook hands with each of us, lastly with Mo. I think he looked at her with a bit of a twinkle in his eye. I received a phone call around 9:30 the next morning. I had a towel around me. Gil was on the bed hoping to watch me dress. Mrs. Gilstrap, a woman asked. Yes, this is Isla. I'm Marie Jett, General Marx's assistant. He's in a meeting and can't call you himself, but he asked me to inform you that Mr. Franklin will be released this afternoon around 3 from the brig. You can find the location on the map or Google. If you can't pick him up, let us know. Do you have the General's number? Yes, I do. This is great news. When will we hear about a trial or charges? Maybe by then. They're still discussing it, she said. I was in the meeting for a bit, and the prosecutor wasn't happy to find there was reason for mitigation. Thank you, Miss Jett, I said. We hung up. Gil was still on the bed. The girls were with Mom and Dad eating some rolls in the hotel lobby. I assumed Mo was in her room. Kyle's being released at 3 this afternoon. They still haven't decided on charges. Good, Gil said. Are we picking him up? Yeah, I said. Gil was looking at me like he sometimes did. You owe me, I said. What? He asked. I'm still waiting. We should take care of that, he said. He rolled over to the edge of the bed. I dropped the towel, went over and joined him. A few minutes passed quickly. We still had things to take care of, but I wasn't worried. We had time. Here's the rewritten text with simpler language, ensuring clarity and removing any content that could be seen as sexually suggestive. I expect to stay focused and strong.
About an hour after we reached the Provost building, I was taken into an office. There stood a tall brigadier general who greeted me with a handshake. Mr. Franklin, I'm General Tom Marx. Your sister-in-law asked me to help you. Is that what you want? A general? As my lawyer? Yes, sir, if you will. Do you know the process? Yes, I've worked on many cases inside and outside the military. I'm a reservist and also with a law firm in Washington, D.C. Right. How much will this cost? Marx smiled. We'll figure it out. Since I'm currently on duty, nothing until after you're charged. I nodded and sat down as he did. I've seen the recordings on YouTube, so I know what happened. I've also talked to your brother and sister-in-law and your co-worker, Dr. Murray. I get that it's not just about losing your wife. Can you tell me why you hit him? I looked into his steady eyes. He waited in silence. Finally, I said, Do you know about his affair with Jill? Yes, I'll need any proof you have. I nodded. I have recordings, a letter from Jill. We could also find proof of her. Is it all in your phone? He interrupted. The videos, emails. The written letter is at home. He thought for a moment. We might need it, but I'll let you know after tomorrow. I told him everything in order, just like I had practiced many times. When I got to the homecoming part, I said I couldn't take it, so I hit him. Okay, did you plan to hit him? Were you trying to make a scene or embarrass him? No. I told Jill before she left for Afghanistan that Semper Fidelis means always faithful, not just to the Marine Corps, but to your values too. When the colonel said it to me, it felt like he was deliberately insulting me. I'm not okay with that. Never. Marx was quiet. How serious is your relationship with Dr. Murray? Were you involved romantically? Such a relationship could hurt your case. I shook my head. No, there's some feeling there, but we never even went to lunch alone except twice for work. We didn't touch or hold hands. We're closer now since Jill died, and we separated before that, but no affair. He drummed his fingers on the table and then stood up. May I call you Kyle? You can call me Tom or General, whichever is comfortable. Sure, Kyle is fine, I said. An affair between officers is a big deal, especially for a commanding officer. The Marine Corps doesn't take fights lightly, but many would understand if you did it in private. Since it was public, it's more serious. I'll talk to you tomorrow. Thank you, General. I don't expect a miracle. He smiled. I can't promise a miracle, but I'll try to help. I liked the Gilstraps and Dr. Murray. If you give me your phone and passwords, I can get what I need. Asterisk. I got a note from General Marx the next morning at about 10:15. It said, "You will be released from the brig this afternoon. We're still discussing charges. Marx." I waited and prayed. I feel like my prayers were heard. "Franklin," someone called. It was my jailer. "Yes." "You're being released. Your lawyer will contact you." He opened the door and gestured me to follow. He gave me a paper. "This way. Stay with me." He walked fast. My phone wasn't with my things. I got my wallet, keys, and some change. I signed a paper. "All but the phone?" he asked. "Your lawyer has it. Good." "Yes, everything else is here. They might need it for a trial." "Maybe, maybe not. Hope not to see you here again, Franklin." "Thanks, Lance Corporal. I never want to come back here." "A lot of people feel that way," he said. A door opened, and I saw Gil, Ayla, and Mo waiting for me through a tunnel of barbed wire and fencing. We hugged, with Mo's hand on my back and my hand on her waist. "So how was it in there?" Gil asked. "Not a fun place, but no one was mistreated," I said. "I shared a cell with a poor kid who just wants out of the Marines. He cried all night." "Not exactly motivated," Gil said. "No," I agreed. We headed to a car in a nearby parking lot. Mo and I walked arm in arm, and it felt natural. Gil and Ayla held hands in front of us. As we got to the car, Ayla's phone rang. "General Marx, we just picked up Kyle." "Yes, okay, we'll see you soon." "He wants to meet us at the motel. I forgot to ask if Mom and Dad could be there." "That's good. All I know is I was released. No word on a trial date or anything," I said. We arrived at the motel, and Ayla asked the desk clerk if we could use a conference room for an hour. Mom and Dad stayed with the sleeping children. Ayla agreed to that. They didn't need reminders of Jill's actions. Marx walked into the lobby where we waited. "General, we have a meeting room ready." Ayla pointed to a door. "Good," he replied. We went in and sat around the table. Mo sat beside me, Marx on the other side. "I'm not sure how much you know about JAG procedures. Usually there aren't specific defense or prosecution lawyers. They are appointed for each case. When I told him I'd been asked to represent Kyle, he appointed one of my old students as the prosecutor. He was good. I convinced... Well, that's not important. They didn't know about Major Kinnison and Colonel Devereaux's affair. I showed a video on the computer, and the prosecutor gave up. Mo asked, "What do you mean he gave up?" Marx paused, looking at Mo like a delicate flower. "He realized the Marine Corps would look bad in a trial. We must protect the Corps and seek justice. The affair could make the Corps seem responsible for a divorce. The Corps condemns affairs between married officers, especially between a boss and an underling." "So what about Kyle?" Mo asked. They agreed to drop the charges. The head of the 2nd Marine Division is sending his deputy to ask Colonel Devereaux to resign right away or lose his pension if we have a trial. "What about the publicity?" I asked. "Will the press demand something?" Marx said, "It might be a problem, but soon everyone will know the colonel doesn't want charges. The headlines are bad now. Gold Star, husband hits colonel was my favorite." We laughed. "Oh, I forgot," Marx said. "Kyle, you must promise me you will never go on another Marine base." Kyle smiled. "I swear I'll never go on a U.S. Marine base again." Marx smiled and nodded. "Thanks." "What about Marge Devereaux?" Ayla asked. "I don't know," Marx said. "It's hard to be divorced at around 45. She might need some time to think." Ayla nodded. "It was new to her yesterday. She might not be in a rush." Gil and I nodded too. Marx looked at his watch. "I have to go. I need to get to New River to reach D.C. before dark. I hate flying in the dark," he said. We all stood up. He shook Ayla's hand first. "You are one of the most beautiful women I've ever met, Mrs. Gilstrap. And honest, it's been an honor." He turned to Gil and shook his hand. "I'm sorry we didn't get to talk. I saw your papers online last night. You have the most interesting ideas. Maybe in the future." Gil nodded. "Thank you. I hope so." Next was Mo. He took her small hand in both of his and leaned down. "I hope you and Kyle stay together. You are lovely and fascinating. I read one of your reviews of a James Jones book." "Really? Allegory? Allegory? We must talk." He smiled and shook his head. Mo blushed. "Kyle, I think you understand the Marines' motto better than most Marines. I might use your story someday if it fits. I'll change the names, of course." "Thank you, General," I said. "You don't need to change the names. Thank you all, and good night." He turned and left. It felt like a strong force had suddenly left. We were silent for a moment. It was getting dark. We would all go home in the morning. Mo and I decided to walk in the park behind the motel. It felt more private, even though anyone could see us from their window. Mo stayed close. Sometimes her hip bumped into mine. Then she took my hand. "Kyle," Mo said, "I love you, you know." "Yeah," I said. "I've known for a while. You know I do." "Yeah," she said. "I've known for a while, too." She seemed deep in thought. "What is it?" I asked, letting go of her hand to put my arm around her. "I'm not Jill," she said. "She'll always be your first love." "Yeah, I know," I said, "but I want you to be my last." We walked in silence. The evening star was out. Shadows grew long and then faded as the sun set. "I want you, Kyle, but I also want you to forgive her. I want her to be in your past." "Why does it matter?" "I don't want to be compared to her. When we are close, I want you to know who is with you." We walked around a small pond with ducks quacking. "You have to meet my parents," she said. "I can't wait." She turned to face me and put her hands around my neck with some effort. She pulled me down to her lips. "Love me," she whispered. I lifted her like a child, feeling her small body against mine. Our lips met hard for the first time.